The wind howls across the endless Russian steppe, a sound both ancient and mournful. Beneath a sky of leaden clouds, the snow carries the whispers of an empire at its zenith and on the brink of ruin. It is the summer of 1942. Germany stands at the height of its power. Across Europe, from the Atlantic coast to the gates of Leningrad, the banners of the Reich flutter over conquered lands. Yet for Adolf Hitler, triumph is never enough. Beyond the horizon lies his next obsession, the oil-rich fields of the Caucasus, the beating heart of the Soviet war machine. To seize them would mean dominion over an empire of fuel and fire. To fail would mean bleeding his armies dry in the vastness of Russia. The plan was simple, at least on paper: Operation Blue, a sweeping offensive across the southern Soviet Union. Panzer divisions, blitzkrieg precision, and the promise of one final victory that would cripple the Red Army forever. But in the furnace of the Russian steppe, plans melt faster than ice in the sun. What began as a campaign of speed soon descended into chaos, stretched supply lines, burning skies, and a relentless enemy that refused to die. From the dusty plains of Voronezh to the industrial ruins of Stalingrad, the tide of war would turn, not with a roar, but with the slow, suffocating collapse of a machine once thought unstoppable. As the steppe froze and the encirclement closed, 300,000 men found themselves trapped in a city of ghosts, a city whose name would echo through history as the grave of German ambition. This is the story of how Operation Blue, a gamble for oil and victory, became the beginning of the end. You are watching Lullaby of Empires, where history breathes, and the echoes of fallen empires whisper once more. Echoes across the steppe. The year was 1942. Across the heart of Europe, a strange calm lingered, a quiet that only victory can create. From the shores of the Atlantic to the plains of Ukraine, the German Reich stretched farther than any empire of its age. Its armies had marched through nations like storms, its banners fluttered above conquered capitals, and its leaders stood convinced that destiny itself had chosen him to reshape the world. Yet far beyond the reach of parades and triumphal speeches, beyond the forests of Poland and the rivers of Belarus, there waited a land so vast that it seemed endless. It was a country of dust and snow, of endless plains and unseen depths. And it was here, in the boundless spaces of the Soviet Union, that Germany's greatest gamble was about to begin. By the summer of that year, Germany's power seemed absolute, but its foundations were already trembling. Behind the gleaming armor of the Wehrmacht lay a machine starving for fuel. Every tank, every truck, every aircraft that had carried the blitzkrieg across Europe now depended on dwindling reserves. The lifeblood of conquest was oil, and there was never enough. The Romanian fields of Ploiești could not sustain the vast engines of war forever. Somewhere to the east lay salvation across the rivers of the Don and the Volga, at the edge of the Caucasus Mountains, beneath the soil of Maikop, Grozny, and Baku. If Germany could seize those fields, it could feed its war machine indefinitely. If it failed, its armies would wither on the steppe. From this need was born a plan, drafted not merely from logic, but from obsession. Its name was Fall Blau, Operation Blue. The objective was monumental: advance through southern Russia, seize the Caucasus oil fields, and cut the Soviet Union's economic heart in two. It was a vision born in the war rooms of East Prussia and refined by generals who still believed that speed, precision, and willpower could overcome any resistance. To Hitler, it was destiny's path restored after the disappointment of Moscow's failed conquest. To his generals, it was a chance to regain momentum, to deliver the blow that might finally end the war in the East. They saw in it not only strategy, but salvation. As the snow of the Russian winter melted into spring mud, preparations began. Across occupied Europe, trains rolled eastward carrying tanks, trucks, and soldiers. Engineers laid down rails and repaired bridges destroyed in the previous year's campaign. In secret depots, new uniforms and weapons were issued. Rumors spread among the ranks this would be the operation that would finish the Soviets. The men believed it because they had to. They had seen their enemies retreat before. They had watched entire divisions crumble under the weight of blitzkrieg. They had crossed rivers, plains, and borders that few thought possible. And so, as the fields of Ukraine turned green again, hundreds of thousands of soldiers prepared to march once more into the endless east. The German High Command divided the coming offensive into stages, each with surgical precision. One force would strike toward Voronezh on the upper Don, securing the flank and luring Soviet reserves away. Another, the heart of the campaign, would sweep south toward the Volga and the Caucasus, where the oil lay waiting. The vast formation known as Army Group South, an empire of men, metal, and motion, was split into two parts. One half would become Army Group A, tasked with conquering the Caucasus Mountains. The other, Army Group B, would turn toward a city whose name bore the mark of the enemy himself, Stalingrad. No one in those early days could have guessed what that name would come to mean. To most of the officers poring over maps, it was just another industrial center on a river. To Hitler, it was something else, a challenge carved in letters of steel. To conquer Stalingrad was to defeat not only a city but a symbol. And so, while oil remained the goal, pride became the fuel. The war that had once been fought for resources and strategy was quietly transforming into a struggle of wills, one that would soon consume everything around it. In June 1942, under a vast blue sky, the operation began. The sound of engines rose across the steppe, the growl of tanks, the thunder of artillery, the rhythmic march of boots through the dust. Columns of panzers cut through the wheat fields, their treads glinting in the sunlight. Above them, the Luftwaffe filled the sky with silver wings. The offensive swept forward like a tide, crushing Soviet outposts, scattering retreating units, and carving new lines on the maps of headquarters far to the west. German soldiers wrote home with words of confidence. "This is the final push," many said. "We will soon have the oil, and then the war will be over." The tone was almost jubilant. Even the endless expanse of the steppe seemed to promise success. But beneath the triumph, cracks were already forming. The land itself was both vast and deceptive. Roads turned to dust in the heat, then to mud after brief rains. Engines clogged, horses collapsed, and men found themselves marching under a sun that baked the earth into shimmering waves of light. Supply lines stretched for hundreds of kilometers. Fuel that was meant to reach the front evaporated in the chaos of movement. What had once been the sleek, synchronized rhythm of blitzkrieg became a lumbering crawl through emptiness. Every kilometer gained was a kilometer harder to maintain. Still, the order was clear: advance, always advance. The illusion of control demanded it. In the villages along the way, the echoes of earlier battles lingered. Burned cottages, shattered churches, and fields, scattered with forgotten helmets, told silent stories of the year before. The locals watched the columns pass with weary eyes. Some greeted the soldiers with bread and salt, hoping for peace. Others hid in cellars, remembering what had come before. The front had moved, but the suffering stayed behind like a shadow. For the German soldier, the world became an endless road, a horizon that never seemed to end, a sky that felt both open and oppressive. By midsummer, the offensive achieved its first victories. The cities of Kharkov and Voronezh fell after fierce fighting. Bridges were captured intact, and once again, German propaganda proclaimed the unstoppable march eastward. Yet, for the officers at headquarters, there was unease. The Soviet army was not collapsing. It was retreating in order, fighting hard for every river and hill. Its losses were heavy, but its spirit unbroken. Intelligence reports showed new divisions forming deeper in the rear. The Red Army had learned from the disasters of the previous year. It would not vanish, it would wait. Still, the momentum carried the Germans onward. Southward, toward the Caucasus, the mountains rose like ghosts in the distance. The promise of oil was almost within reach. Engineers began preparing pipelines and refineries that did not yet exist, so certain were they of victory. But as the focus shifted south, something subtle yet fateful occurred. The forces that had once moved as one were divided. Army Group A turned toward the mountains. while Army Group B pivoted toward the Volga. What had been a single spearhead now became two separate blades, each sharp but weaker alone. It was a decision that would echo through history, a fracture born of ambition. The soldiers on the ground could not see the grand lines drawn on maps. They saw only the dust and heat, the endless marching, and the strange feeling that the war no longer moved forward with purpose but drifted, like a river losing its current. Among them were veterans of France and Poland, men who had seen the lightning wars that conquered Europe. They knew how victory felt: swift, clean, absolute. This felt different. The resistance was growing fiercer, the land wider, and the sense of progress thinner. For the first time, whispers began to circulate in letters home. The steppe was swallowing them. As the sun dipped lower in the sky and the days shortened, a new word began to circulate among the ranks: Stalingrad. It was spoken quietly at first, as if naming it could change their fortune. Rumors said it was a fortress of factories, a city that stretched along the Volga like a serpent. To conquer it would be a symbol, perhaps even an ending. The men believed it would come quickly, another victory in the long chain of victories. They did not yet know that the city ahead would be unlike any they had ever faced. In the headquarters at Vinnytsia, Hitler followed every report with growing intensity. Maps covered his tables, dotted with colored pins marking divisions and advances. He studied them not as a general but as an artist studying his canvas. Each new town captured was another stroke in the masterpiece he envisioned: a German empire reaching the oil of the Caucasus and the shores of the Caspian Sea. Those around him sensed the transformation. Military logic was giving way to personal will. The operation was no longer a campaign of necessity, it had become a campaign of ego. And so the armies marched on. Each mile forward carried them deeper into the heart of the Soviet Union, deeper into a landscape that seemed to stretch forever. The steppe swallowed sound and distance alike. At night, the soldiers lay under skies so vast that the stars seemed close enough to touch. They wrote of the silence, of the wind that moved across the grass, of the strange beauty of a land that refused to end. But beauty can be deceptive. In that silence, fate was gathering. By late August, the first German units reached the outskirts of Stalingrad. The Volga shimmered in the distance like a blade of silver. Beyond it lay the heart of the Soviet defense, the factories of steel and smoke that bore the city's name. The men who had crossed a continent now stood at the threshold of destiny. They believed they were on the verge of victory, unaware that what awaited them was not triumph but entrapment, an ordeal that would consume them, body and soul. The wind swept across the plain, carrying with it the dust of 1,000 roads and the faint scent of oil from the distant refineries. The steppe was quiet again, but beneath that quiet, something vast and terrible was stirring. Operation Blue, conceived in confidence and fueled by ambition, was about to cross the line where conquest ends and catastrophe begins. Dreams of fuel and fire. In the stillness of early 1942, before the engines began to roar again, the war in the East entered a strange interlude, a season of recovery and anticipation. Snow lay deep across the Russian steppe, muffling the scars of the previous year's battles. Burned villages slept beneath layers of frost. Wrecked tanks protruded like fossils from the drifts. The smoke had cleared, but the memory of Moscow's failure still lingered like a shadow across the German high command. Hitler did not speak of defeat. He spoke of opportunity. The setbacks of the winter were, in his mind, merely pauses, the breath before the final blow. And so, while soldiers thawed frozen rations in their field, stoves and engineers repaired engines in the cold light of temporary hangars, plans began to take shape once more. Somewhere in the vast silence of the Eastern Front, a new dream was forming, one born not of caution but of hunger. The hunger was for oil. Without it, the Reich's victories would turn to ash. Every truck that carried supplies to the front, every tank that clawed its way across the steppe, every aircraft that rose into the sky depended on fuel that was vanishing faster than it could be replaced. The oil fields of Romania could no longer sustain the ambition of a world-spanning war. Hitler's gaze drifted southward toward the shimmering promise of the Caucasus. where the wells of Baku and Grozny fed the Soviet war machine. Whoever held them would hold the beating heart of modern warfare. He imagined more than conquest, he imagined permanence. In his mind's eye, he saw German engineers pumping oil beneath, mountain peaks crowned with snow. He saw pipelines stretching west toward a continent reshaped by victory. He saw, beyond the horizon, an empire self-sufficient and eternal. His generals, ever cautious yet obedient, turned this vision into maps, directives, and timetables. The name chosen for this enterprise was Fall Blau Case Blue. Meetings followed one another like ritual. In conference rooms thick with cigarette smoke, the outlines of the campaign were drawn. Charts marked with red arrows crawled across the maps of southern Russia, elegant lines that promised control over distances few could truly imagine. Intelligence officers spoke of weakened Soviet morale, of depleted reserves, of factories too far behind the front to matter. Their words soothed the doubts of men who wanted to believe. No one in those rooms felt the wind of the steppe on their face, or heard the creak of supply trucks climbing frozen hills. Among the generals, there was both confidence and unease. They had seen what Russian winters could do. They knew the enormity of the land and the tenacity of the people who defended it. Yet the logic of hierarchy was iron. Orders came from above, and faith or the semblance of it flowed downward. The Wehrmacht would move again. It would gather its strength in the spring and strike south with a force that no army could withstand. While the planners debated and the weather warmed, the front transformed. Fields that had been scarred by shells began to bloom again. Peasants returned to the ruins of their villages, mending fences, tilling soil blackened by war. The birds came back, and with them, a fragile illusion of peace. Behind that illusion, the German war machine awakened. Locomotives thundered east, carrying columns of men, fuel drums, and endless boxes of ammunition. The depots at Kharkov and Kursk swelled with supplies. The roads filled once more with the rhythmic growl of engines. The men who would march into this new campaign were veterans of a dozen nations. They had crossed the rivers of France, the forests of Poland, the plains of Ukraine. They were confident, hardened, and weary in equal measure. Letters from home spoke of spring flowers, of cities untouched by war, of promises that the campaign to come would be the last. Many wanted to believe it. They had seen too much to be naive, yet the hope of an ending still glimmered in them, the idea that one more victory might finally bring them home. In the rear, propaganda painted the coming offensive as destiny fulfilled. Posters showed sunlit oil fields and proud soldiers gazing eastward. Newspapers described the Soviet Union as a collapsing giant, its armies reeling from last year's defeats. But those who studied the battlefield more closely sensed something different. Soviet industry was not dying, it was moving. Entire factories had been dismantled and reassembled beyond the Urals, far from the reach of the Luftwaffe. New divisions were being trained, new tanks rolling from production lines. The Red Army that had faltered outside Moscow was learning, adapting, and waiting. Still, Operation Blue moved forward, unstoppable in its conception. Army Group South, an empire of 500,000 men, was the instrument of its execution. Its tanks gleamed beneath the early sun. Its artillery lined up like clockwork along the Donets River. When the signal came, they would move with the precision of a machine long perfected. To the men at headquarters, it all seemed certain equations written in steel and discipline. To the soldiers at the front, it was something less abstract, another long march into an unknown horizon. The offensive began with thunder. In June, under skies of perfect blue, the guns opened. The ground shook as artillery rolled its message eastward. Waves of tanks and trucks followed, kicking dust into the air until the landscape blurred into a haze of motion. Villages vanished beneath the columns. Rivers were crossed in hours. At first, everything moved as it had in the early triumphs of the war. Soviet resistance appeared thin, scattered, even disorganized. Reports spoke of encircled armies, of thousands of prisoners. Radio broadcasts celebrated each advance as proof that the enemy was finished. But beneath the surface, the rhythm had changed. The vastness of the land absorbed speed like sand absorbs water. The more the armies advanced, the farther their supplies had to travel. Each mile conquered demanded another mile of fuel, another convoy of ammunition, another bridge to repair. The long serpents of supply lines trailed behind the spearheads, vulnerable and exhausted. The dream of swift conquest was beginning to collide with the geography of reality. In the officers' tents at night, maps were spread across folding tables. Cigarette smoke curled toward canvas ceilings as commanders traced their progress with gloved fingers. To the north lay the Don, to the east the Volga, and beyond it the glint of oil and the shadow of the Caucasus. The names sounded distant yet intimate, as if geography itself were whispering promises. But in every report there were warnings, rail lines overstretched, bridges blown, units waiting for fuel that never came. Each delay was dismissed as temporary, a mere inconvenience. Faith in momentum replaced caution. Among the soldiers, the advance took on a rhythm of repetition. Days of blinding sun, nights of dust and fatigue. The steppe stretched on forever, a sea of yellow grass rippling beneath the wind. Convoys moved like ships, each isolated in its own wake of dust. The air smelled of petrol, sweat, and the dry sweetness of grain fields burning on the horizon. Sometimes, in the stillness before dawn, they could hear artillery echoing far ahead, the pulse of a war that seemed endless. In the villages they passed, people watched silently from doorways. Some offered water, others only their gaze. For them, armies had become seasons. They came, they went, and they left the earth scarred in their wake. Children stared at the columns of tanks as if watching a story without an ending. To many soldiers, these faces blurred into the landscape, part of the rhythm of the march, reminders that war, however vast, always passed through the lives of the small and the nameless. As the weeks passed, the German spearheads diverged. Army Group A turned south toward the mountains, chasing the promise of oil. Army Group B swung east toward the Volga, toward the city that carried the enemy's name. It was a division that seemed logical at first, two objectives, two fronts. But in the long corridors of command, some sensed the danger. Splitting forces in such an immense land was like dividing breath in a storm. What was meant to sharpen the blade would soon weaken it. In Berlin, maps of progress were displayed with pride. Hitler followed every movement with fervent attention. He spoke of destiny, of the march toward resources that would secure the Reich for 1,000 years. The generals listened, wary of his certainty but unwilling to contradict it. Doubt was a quiet thing in those rooms, and ambition a loud one. The weather turned hotter, the steppe shimmered beneath the sun, engines overheated, men collapsed from thirst, and horses struggled through fields turned to powder. The land seemed to fight back, offering no shelter and little mercy. Yet still the orders came. Advance, seize, hold. The voice of command carried farther than reason. In the evening, soldiers watched the horizon glow with the fires of burning towns. The sunsets of southern Russia were vast, bleeding from gold to crimson to black. In those moments, many felt both awe and unease, the beauty of the world, mingling with the knowledge that they were destroying it. Some wrote home describing the light, the silence, the way the sky seemed endless. Others stopped writing altogether. The war was consuming language itself, replacing words with movement. By late summer, the momentum that had once seemed effortless began to slow. The further the armies moved, the more they became shadows of themselves, extended, exhausted, and unsure of what lay ahead. The oil of the Caucasus was still a promise, the Volga still a line on a map. Between ambition and reality lay distance measured not just in kilometers but in human endurance. And yet, in the minds of those who commanded, the dream persisted. They imagined columns of tanks refueled from captured wells, aircraft rising from newly claimed airfields, the war renewed with infinite energy. They believed that within reach lay the key to victory, the substance that powered both machines and illusions, the black river of oil that could burn forever. But the dream was already betraying them. Each kilometer gained cost, another fraction of strength, another heartbeat of the army's vitality. The fuel they sought to seize was the very fuel they were consuming in the chase. The farther they advanced, the emptier their tanks became. Strategy had become hunger, and hunger had become blindness. As the steppe darkened under the fading sun of 1942, a strange quiet returned. The men of Army Group B could see the shimmer of the Volga in the distance. The river seemed to breathe beneath the evening haze, wide, patient, indifferent. Beyond it rose a city of smoke and steel, Stalingrad. To the soldiers who gazed upon it, it was a destination. To history, it would become a grave. The wind swept over the plains, carrying the smell of burning fuel and distant rain. In that wind, there was something prophetic, a whisper that no one could hear clearly yet. It was the sound of the dream turning to fire. Dividing the dragon. The summer of 1942 hung heavy over the steppe. The heat was relentless, pressing against the horizon until the sky seemed to ripple. Dust rose from every road and drifted like smoke through the air. Across the vast expanse of southern Russia, the German advance moved onward, columns of men and machines stretching for miles, shimmering like mirages under the sun. On the maps, the lines of the offensive looked flawless. In reality, they were beginning to stretch thinner than anyone dared to admit. The campaign had started with such clarity. The objectives were drawn with clean precision: the oil of the Caucasus, the river of the Volga, and the shattering of Soviet resistance in the south. Every report that reached headquarters spoke of progress, of cities taken, of Soviet divisions destroyed. From the perspective of Berlin, the offensive was unfolding exactly as planned. Yet inside the minds of the men who commanded it, a question began to form, one that whispered rather than shouted. How far could they go before the land swallowed them whole? Army Group South, the mightiest formation on the Eastern Front, was the instrument of this ambition. It contained some of Germany's finest divisions, panzer armies, mechanized infantry, and air support in abundance. For months they had advanced through wheat fields and over rivers, through dust storms and endless villages. The names of towns became milestones in dispatches: Kursk, Voronezh, Rostov. But as they moved farther south, the distances between those names grew longer, the time between victories slower. Each step forward demanded more from men already worn thin by a year of ceaseless fighting. It was at this moment, when the offensive still seemed unstoppable, when confidence still cloaked exhaustion, that the great decision came. Hitler believed the time had come to split his forces. The order was simple in wording but monumental in consequence. Army Group South would be divided into two separate commands: Army Group A to seize the Caucasus and its oil fields, and Army Group B to strike east toward the Volga and capture Stalingrad. On paper, it was a masterpiece of efficiency: two thrusts, one for resources, one for strategy. In practice, it was the moment when the single blade of the German advance was broken in two. The generals hesitated. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, who had commanded Army Group South, argued that the move risked everything. Dividing the army meant dividing strength, stretching supply lines even further across an unforgiving land. But Hitler's mind was already set. He had begun to see himself not merely as a commander, but as the embodiment of destiny. To him, caution was weakness. The step had to be mastered, not negotiated. When von Bock voiced his doubts, he was dismissed. His caution was replaced with obedience. And so, in late July, the dragon was divided. Army Group A turned southward toward the mountains, toward the promise of oil gleaming under the Caucasian sun. Army Group B pivoted eastward, toward the Volga and the city that bore the name of the Soviet leader. The air filled with the sound of engines shifting direction, of convoys splitting apart, of divisions peeling away from one another across hundreds of kilometers of open land. The split was silent, almost invisible, but it marked the beginning of a fracture that could never be mended. For the men on the ground, the change meant movement, always movement. They packed up camp, rolled forward, and left behind roads they would never see again. The fields turned to dust, and the rivers they crossed grew shallower and harder to ford. They had no sense of the grand strategy. they saw only the endless horizon, the shimmering heat, and the occasional glint of water in the distance. Yet the difference between north and south, between Volga and Caucasus, was more than geography. It was the division between ambition and necessity, between the dream of empire and the reality of war. In the south, the columns of Army Group A pressed toward the mountains. The Caucasus rose slowly before them, blue and distant at first, then sharp and jagged as they drew near. Villages gave way to rocky paths. Rivers cut deep through valleys. It was a new kind of war, fought not across flat plains but along narrow passes and winding roads. The air smelled of pine and snow even in summer. The soldiers who climbed those slopes felt as though they were chasing ghosts. The oil fields of Maikop and Grozny still lay ahead, shimmering like promises that retreated with every step. Meanwhile, Army Group B advanced toward Stalingrad. The land there was flatter, wider, harsher. The sun burned hotter, and the rivers ran low. The Volga, long, slow, and ancient, shimmered on the horizon like a mirage. Between the army and that river stretched a maze of fields and villages, of dry creek beds and dust storms. Every day brought another town taken, another skirmish won, but also another convoy delayed, another tank left behind for lack of fuel. The same land that seemed to open before them was slowly tightening its grip. In both directions, the illusion of control persisted. Reports from the front glowed with optimism. Prisoners were counted by the thousands. Soviet formations were said to be shattered. Even the weather was described as favorable. But inside those lines of type, the cracks were widening. Units complained of missing supplies, of engines failing from overuse, of maps that bore no resemblance to the terrain they crossed. The generals at the front, men like Paulus and Kleist, began to send cautious messages to headquarters, asking for clarification, for reinforcement, for fuel. What they received instead were speeches about destiny. In the forests near Vinnytsia, Hitler reviewed the maps himself. His staff watched as he leaned over the table, the colored lines tracing across southern Russia like veins of a living thing. His hand hovered over the Volga, over the city that bore Stalin's name. "It must be taken," he said. "The symbol is more important than the substance." The oil of the Caucasus would feed the Reich, but Stalingrad would feed the legend. The two objectives were no longer complementary, they were competing. And no army, however strong, could serve two masters across the immensity of the steppe. Still, the orders went out, the divisions marched. The air filled with the sound of engines and the clatter of tracks. From the sky, the smoke of burning villages marked their path. For the soldiers who followed those routes, the sense of direction was less clear than ever. Each man carried his own version of the war, the one in his orders, the one in his memory, and the one that existed in the silence between them. Some wrote home that victory was near. Others no longer believed it but lacked the words to say so. By August, the German army was advancing along two great axes, one southward into the mountains, one eastward toward the Volga. Between them stretched hundreds of miles of open space, guarded by thin lines of Axis allies, Romanians, Hungarians, Italians. They were brave men but ill-equipped, holding positions far beyond what they could defend. Their rifles were old, their anti-tank guns few, their morale fragile. To them fell the task of guarding the flanks of an empire. The fate of the entire operation and of the Sixth Army itself rested on their shoulders without them even knowing it. The farther the Germans advanced, the more those flanks became their weakness. Soviet intelligence noticed the gaps, the overextended supply lines, the tired divisions guarding too much ground with too few men. Reports reached Moscow, where Stalin and his generals waited like hunters, watching the slow movement of prey. For now, the Red Army still retreated, bleeding but alive. But every mile the Germans gained would make their loss heavier when the counterblow came. Inside the German lines, the change was harder to see. Victories still came, though they no longer felt clean. The city of Voronezh fell after days of bitter fighting, and the ruins smoked for weeks afterward. To the south, Maikop's oil fields were captured, or what was left of them. The Soviets had burned the wells before retreating. The air was thick with the smell of charred crude, the ground slick with black mud. The prize had turned to poison. German engineers struggled to repair the damage. But the fires burned on, dark pillars rising against the pale sky. The dream of endless fuel was slipping away even as they stood upon it. At Stalingrad's edge, the Volga glimmered like a distant mirror. The city lay stretched along its western bank, a sprawl of factories, smokestacks, and workers' housing. It was not beautiful, but it was defiant. The first reconnaissance flights reported trenches, artillery, and camouflage defenses woven through the industrial district. What had once been just a name on a map now revealed itself as a fortress. Still, the orders were unchanged. Stalingrad was to be taken, quickly, decisively, absolutely. As August faded into September, the steppe changed color. The grasses turned from gold to brown. The air cooled. The nights grew longer. The soldiers who had marched so far began to feel the first bite of the coming winter. They had been told that the campaign would be over by then, that the oil and the Volga would be theirs before the cold returned. But the cold did not wait for victory. It crept forward as they advanced, slow and merciless. The division of Army Group South had been meant to accelerate victory. Instead, it had scattered strength across a land that devoured distance. The farther they moved, the thinner they became. The once mighty dragon had two heads now, and both were beginning to tire. Each fought in a different direction, each consuming the same dwindling breath of supply and fuel. From above, the maps still looked like triumph. On the ground, it felt more like survival. By the time the first German shells fell on the outskirts of Stalingrad, the fate of the entire campaign had already been sealed, not by battle, but by geometry. The lines that had once converged in purpose had diverged in ambition. Between the oil and the river, between the dream and the dust, the space for victory had quietly vanished. And still, they marched. The steppe stretched on before them, endless and indifferent. The sun sank into the haze, and the shadows lengthened over the land. Somewhere far behind, the mountains glowed red in the evening light, the reflection of burning oil, the fire of a dream dividing itself in two. March to the Volga. The wind across the steppe carried the scent of dust and fuel. It moved low and steady, curling through the grass like a ghost of earlier summers. To the men of the Sixth Army, it was the breath of distance itself, dry, endless, unrelenting. Each dawn began the same way, the shimmer of heat rising from the plains, the sound of engines coughing to life, the groan of machinery that had long since ceased to sound triumphant. The road ahead led east, toward a name that now hung over every conversation, every letter home, every whispered hope of rest. Stalingrad. From the air it looked like a ribbon of smoke beside the silver thread of the Volga, a long industrial sprawl of chimneys and factories pressed against the water. For the soldiers approaching it, it seemed to grow out of the horizon itself, a line that refused to come nearer, no matter how far they marched. The heat turned the distance into a mirage. Days passed in a haze of sweat and dust, until even the maps felt abstract. The nearer they came, the more elusive the city seemed, as though it were receding before them. Behind them lay half a continent of conquest, but it no longer felt like victory. Every mile gained cost more fuel, more strength, more certainty. Supply convoys straggled across roads, pitted by use and clogged by the ruins of their own advance. Trucks broke down, horses died in their harnesses, and soldiers scavenged abandoned vehicles for parts. At headquarters, charts still showed neat arrows sweeping east, but in the field, the lines were smudged, the rhythm of the campaign dissolving into fatigue. Yet momentum was a language the army understood, and so it pressed on. Commanders spoke of discipline, of endurance, of destiny. They invoked the great victories of the past, Poland, France, the first days in Russia, to rekindle faith in the machine. For many, it worked. Habit and hierarchy have their own gravity, and men marched not because they still believed in triumph, but because stopping seemed unthinkable. The landscape itself seemed to resist them. The Don River crossed their path like a serpent, wide and slow, its banks lined with willows and mud. Pontoon bridges were thrown across it in haste, trembling under the weight of tanks and artillery. Engineers worked knee-deep in water, hammering timbers beneath a sun that burned their necks raw. Overhead, the Luftwaffe roared, strafing distant positions that flickered like sparks along the horizon. The crossing succeeded barely, but the effort left entire divisions stranded for days, waiting for fuel and ammunition to catch up. Beyond the river, the land opened again into a shimmering emptiness. Villages appeared like mirages, low roofs, whitewashed walls, wells surrounded by children and old women. The columns passed through them wordlessly. Some villagers offered bread or water, others only silence. The war had already passed through these places too many times to inspire curiosity. It had become part of the weather, something that came and went, leaving dust and absence behind. The further east the army moved, the more it thinned. Men were left behind to guard depots, bridges, and railheads. Every delay, every mechanical failure, peeled strength from the spearhead. The front looked powerful on paper, but in reality, it was a stretched cord vibrating under strain. The air smelled of fuel leaks and sweat. Letters home spoke of thirst, of engines failing, of the strange quiet that settled over the steppe at dusk. And still, orders demanded speed. The Volga must be reached before the Soviets could regroup. The Sixth Army's commander, Friedrich Paulus, drove his men onward with methodical precision. He was a meticulous man, a planner more than a warrior, careful and loyal to a fault. His subordinates admired his calm, though some whispered that calmness was another form of denial. To Paulus, the plan was everything, and the plan said advance. Above him, in the distant command centers of the Reich, the meaning of the campaign was already changing. The original objective, the oil of the Caucasus, was receding into abstraction. Hitler's focus had shifted to Stalingrad itself. It had become more than a waypoint. It was a symbol, a challenge, a name to be conquered. It must fall, he declared. No retreat, no hesitation. For him, to capture Stalingrad was to strike directly at the soul of his enemy. For the men at the front, it meant marching toward a city that promised only exhaustion and fire. By late August, the first reconnaissance units could see the Volga glinting through the haze. The river seemed unreal, too wide, too calm, a line of silver separating worlds. On its far bank, Soviet barges moved slowly, ferrying men and supplies to the defenders. The Luftwaffe struck them from the sky, and the water burned with oil and debris. From the western bank, the Germans watched smoke rise into the dusk and believed the city must soon fall. They did not yet know that they were only standing at the threshold of the storm. Then came the bombardment. The Luftwaffe's planes filled the sky in endless waves, their shadows crawling across the earth. Bombs fell with the rhythm of thunder. The ground convulsed. The air became a roar of dust and glass. Factories, apartment blocks, tram lines, all dissolved into rubble. By night, the city glowed red, as if from within, its horizon jagged with flame. Pilots radioed back to command that nothing could have survived. The reports spoke of annihilation. But beneath the smoke, the city still lived. In basements and cellars, in trenches dug through factory floors, the defenders endured. Civilians became soldiers, workers became gunners. The ruins themselves became fortresses. When the dust cleared and the German infantry moved in, they found not a corpse, but a labyrinth, a place where every wall concealed resistance. Streets no longer existed, only paths of broken stone and shadow. The first skirmishes were confusing, close, and merciless. Machine gun nests fired from collapsed windows. Snipers waited in towers that had lost their roofs. Every corner hid movement. The Germans advanced meter by meter, often losing ground they had gained an hour earlier. The city's geography seemed to shift with every explosion. Maps became meaningless, the front blurred into a maze of smoke. From above, Stalingrad looked like an open wound. Entire districts were flattened, yet the fighting never ceased. The factories, Red October, Barricade, Tractor Works, became names whispered like incantations among the soldiers. To capture one was to climb through ruins where every brick seemed to breathe hostility. Grenades rolled through hallways, bayonets flashed in stairwells, and artillery fire rained ceaselessly from the outskirts. As the days lengthened into weeks, a new kind of war took hold, one that no doctrine had prepared them for. This was not the blitzkrieg of open plains or swift maneuvers. It was a war of rooms and corridors, of silence and sudden death. Whole companies were lost for the sake of a single building. The smell of brick dust and cordite filled every breath. To the men fighting there, the world had shrunk to the space between two walls. Outside the city, the steppe continued to swallow the army's strength. Supply convoys moved at night to avoid Soviet aircraft. Horses pulled wagons through mud that reeked of fuel. The autumn rains had begun, and with them came the first hint of cold. Soldiers shivered in wet uniforms, their boots dissolving into the muck. The illusion of summer was fading, and with it the hope that this campaign would end quickly. Paulus sent requests for reinforcements, for fuel, for winter clothing. The answers came back delayed or uncertain. The Luftwaffe promised to maintain air superiority. The High Command promised that the Volga would soon be secured. Each promise was a stone laid on the foundation of belief. Yet in the field, belief was becoming brittle. Every man could feel the edges of the trap forming, though no one dared to name it. For the Soviets, Stalingrad was no longer just a city either. It was a symbol of survival, the edge beyond which they would not retreat. Reinforcements crossed the river at night under fire, bringing ammunition, bread, and determination. They sang songs to steady their hearts as the water hissed around them. The city's ruins swallowed them, but the fight they carried within refused to die. The German soldiers began to sense this change. The enemy no longer scattered before them. He waited, invisible and patient. Every advance felt heavier, every victory smaller. The war of motion had become a war of endurance. Each day's progress could be measured in meters, and every night ended in the same exhausted silence, a silence filled with the creak of metal cooling and the soft, steady moan of the Volga's wind. From the west came rumors of the Caucasus bogged down, of divisions starving for supplies, of entire regiments pinned in the mountains. But news traveled slowly, filtered through optimism and denial. At Stalingrad, the men were too busy surviving to wonder what was happening beyond their horizon. Their world had narrowed to smoke and rubble. The Volga remained on their right flank, a mirror that caught the glow of burning oil and turning leaves. Sometimes at night, when the wind shifted, they could hear faint singing from the opposite bank's Soviet soldiers in the darkness, their voices low and steady. It carried across the water like a memory, something older than the war itself. Some German soldiers listened and felt a strange ache they could not name. Others fired into the dark, unable to bear the reminder that the enemy was still alive. As September bled into October, the nights grew sharper. Frost rimmed the ruins in silver. The dead lay where they fell, frozen into the earth. The smell of decay was replaced by the clean cold of approaching winter. Fires burned in oil drums. Men huddled around them, faces hollowed by exhaustion. They spoke less, moved slower, dreamed rarely. The city had consumed their language as surely as it consumed their strength, and yet, through all this, orders remained unchanged. Stalingrad must fall. The Volga must be cut. The dream of oil and victory, once so vast, had shrunk to a handful of streets and a riverbank. The army that had conquered continents was now trapped in a struggle for walls and staircases. The sound of artillery never stopped. It became the pulse of the place, steady, merciless, almost hypnotic. From his headquarters, Paulus watched reports pile up like snowdrifts. Ammunition shortages, fuel exhaustion, rising casualties. Each request for reprieve returned with the same reply: hold position, continue the attack. Behind those words lay a truth that no one could speak aloud. They had already gone too far to turn back. Outside, the wind shifted again, colder now, coming down from the north. It carried with it a whisper of something vast, moving beyond sight, something that would soon change everything. But for now, the soldiers of the Sixth Army marched still, step by weary step, through the ruins of a city that had become both their goal and their grave. The Volga waited, silent and eternal, reflecting the fires that crowned the night. The river had seen empires rise and vanish. It watched another approach, steady and proud, unaware that the current was already turning against it. And in that vast stillness, amid the smoke and snow and starlight, the long road of Operation Blue had reached its threshold. The river they had sought for months was finally before them, but beyond its glittering surface lay not salvation, but the slow unraveling of everything they had believed indestructible. The city of smoke, the first breath of autumn settled over Stalingrad like a veil of ash. The air hung thick with the smell of fuel and brick dust, a perfume born of fire and ruin. The city stretched for miles along the western bank of the Volga, once alive with the hum of factories and the chatter of markets. Now it was a landscape of broken walls and flickering light, a labyrinth carved by war itself. To the men of the Sixth Army, it was both prize and punishment, a place that drew them forward even as it consumed them. At dawn, the city seemed almost still. Columns of smoke rose in slow spirals from the ruins, catching the first pale rays of the sun. The Volga shimmered quietly beside it, wide and indifferent, reflecting both the sky and the fires that never truly died. Somewhere within that haze, Soviet defenders moved like shadows. They were there in the silence, unseen but felt in the twitch of a curtain, in the echo of a rifle shot that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. The first assaults were cautious. Patrols crept through the outskirts, past fields littered with wrecked trams and torn fences. They found streets that led nowhere, staircases that ended in air. The city's structure had been broken by the bombardment, its geometry turned against the invader. Buildings leaned over one another, like old men whispering secrets. In the basements, civilians huddled in the dark with what remained of their belongings. Children stared with wide, unblinking eyes. They had stopped crying weeks ago. Then came the full attack. The artillery opened like a thunderclap, and the Sixth Army surged into the ruins. They entered through gaps blasted into the walls, through tunnels dug beneath the streets. Machine gun fire rattled through corridors that once housed offices and schools. Grenades burst in the stairwells, sending dust spiraling into the light. Every block was a battlefield. Every window was an eye. The fighting had no front line, only fragments. A street might change hands 5 times in a single day. Men fought for factories, for courtyards, for rooms. Sometimes they could hear the enemy breathing on the other side of the wall. The echo of footsteps on concrete became a warning. The flicker of light through a crack, a reason to fire. The city reduced everything to nearness, not nations, not ideologies, just the next few meters of broken ground and whoever lived long enough to claim them. Paulus watched from his headquarters, a few kilometers behind the line. Reports arrived every hour, each one a litany of numbers. Shells expended, buildings captured, men lost. The map on his table grew darker with ink, block by block, as if the city itself were bleeding beneath his pen. To Berlin, the progress looked steady. To the soldiers in the rubble, it was endless repetition. Fight, rest, fight again, all measured in heartbeats and handfuls of dust. The Soviets fought with a quiet ferocity. They called it the battle for every brick. Behind each wall was another, behind each ruin a new defense. Workers' militias, sailors, and factory laborers stood beside trained soldiers, their uniforms mismatched, their faces streaked with soot. Snipers ruled the rooftops. Among them was a man whose name would one day travel far beyond the Volga, Vasily Zaitsev, patient as winter itself. He waited hours for a single shot, moving through the shadows like part of the city's soul. The Germans learned to fear the silence more than the noise. Noise meant life, movement, purpose. Silence meant the enemy was watching. Entire squads vanished into that silence, swallowed by the ruins. The Factories were the worst great cathedrals of metal and dust, where machines stood like monuments to labor, now turned to war. In the glow of fires, the cranes and girders cast long skeletal shadows across the floors. Here, men fought with pistols, knives, and bare hands, each clash echoing through the hollow space until it was impossible to tell who had cried out last. Outside the industrial districts, the living tried to exist amid the dead. Civilians dug shelters beneath collapsed walls, trading scraps of bread for news. The Volga was their lifeline. At night, barges crossed from the eastern bank under cover of darkness, bringing supplies and reinforcements. Many were sunk mid-river, burning where the water met the sky, yet still they came. The river carried men to the front and carried away the wounded, a slow current of endurance flowing through the middle of destruction. As September turned to October, the days grew shorter. The smoke thickened until it seemed the sun itself had been dimmed. The air was dry and heavy, the dust clinging to every surface, to every breath. The soldiers stopped noticing the smell of death. It had blended with the smell of earth and oil. They moved through the ruins like sleepwalkers, their faces masked in soot, their eyes rimmed with exhaustion. At night, the city burned in silence. Flames licked the skeletons of buildings, painting the sky with a dull orange glow. The Volga glimmered beneath it, black and reflective, as if mirroring the destruction for eternity. The wind carried ash far across the steppe. Sometimes, from the opposite bank, the Soviets could see the glow and whisper to one another that the city was still alive, because its heart was still burning. Inside the German lines, fatigue was beginning to fray. Certainty, rations grew smaller, ammunition ran low. The factories they had captured offered shelter but little else. Every victory felt hollow, a building taken only to be shelled to rubble an hour later. Officers rotated units through the front like pieces on a chessboard, but the board itself was dissolving. The men who entered the ruins were not the same when they came out. Some stared without seeing, others trembled at sudden sounds. The word Stalingrad began to carry a new weight, one that could not be measured in territory. For the Red Army, the suffering was no less. Entire regiments were wiped out and replaced within days. But each death bought time, and time was the one resource they could afford to spend. Reinforcements crossed the Volga relentlessly. They came in fishing boats, in rafts made of logs, even swimming when the barges failed. They came knowing what waited for them on the other shore. They came because the city still stood. In Berlin, Hitler listened to radio reports that described the campaign as nearly complete. He imagined his flag flying over the ruins and declared the battle won before it had truly begun. His generals tried to temper his optimism, but he silenced them. To retreat from Stalingrad, he said, would be to retreat from destiny itself. The word surrender did not exist in his vocabulary. He demanded victory at any cost, a command that would, in time, become an epitaph. The weather turned colder. Frost crept over the ruins at night, catching the embers in a faint glitter. The mornings brought mist rising from the Volga, thick enough to hide the shapes of men until they were only voices in the fog. The sound of artillery echoed longer now, bouncing between the frozen walls. The city had become an echo chamber of war, its heartbeat the drum of distant guns. Inside one of the ruined buildings, a German soldier wrote in his diary, "There is no day, no night, only smoke. The air tastes of metal. We fight for rooms that no longer exist." He folded the page and tucked it into his coat, uncertain if anyone would ever read it. In another basement, across the line, a Soviet nurse wrapped a soldier's wound with a strip torn from her own coat. She whispered something to him, not of victory, but of mourning, of the river, of the life that might exist beyond it. The soldier smiled faintly, though neither believed the words. In that moment, the war felt very far away, even though it pressed against the walls. By November, the snow had begun to fall. It came softly at first, melting on the fires, then heavier, blanketing the ruins in pale silence. The city looked almost peaceful beneath it. The black scars of the buildings softened, the craters filled with white. But beneath that quiet beauty, the struggle deepened. The snow muffled the footsteps, the gunfire, the cries turning everything into a muted rhythm. It was as if the world itself were weary of sound. The Germans dug in for winter, convinced that one more push would end it. The Soviets prepared something else entirely. Far beyond the city, in the vastness of the steppe, entire armies were gathering silent, unseen, waiting for the order to move. But within Stalingrad, no one could imagine the scale of what was coming. The men inside those ruins had already begun to believe that the world had shrunk to this one burning frozen city and that their lives would begin and end there. At night, the wind blew from the east, sweeping through the skeletons of buildings and over the frozen river. It carried a low hum, the sound of the Volga moving beneath its thin layer of ice, unbothered by the struggle above. The men heard it in their sleep and dreamed of water, of motion, of escape. But when they woke, the city was still there, endless and gray, the smoke rising like breath from its broken lungs. In those final days before the storm, the Sixth Army still believed it could win. The reports were grim, the faces hollow, but the machine of obedience still turned. They did not yet know that the city was not a battlefield, it was a trap that had already begun to close. And so the days continued, indistinguishable from one another, until time itself seemed to slow. Snow fell, fire burned, men fought, and the Volga flowed on, carrying with it the faint reflection of a city that no longer belonged to the living. Whispers of the Volga winter crept over Stalingrad without ceremony. One morning the wind changed, and the Volga, that broad silver ribbon that had mirrored smoke and flame for months, began to glaze over with thin sheets of ice. The water moved slower, whispering beneath the frost like something half asleep. The days shortened, and the light lost its warmth. Shadows stretched across the ruins like tired limbs. It was the kind of cold that made every sound sharper. The crack of a rifle echoed for miles. The rustle of paper in a pocket felt like thunder. Inside the city, the Sixth Army had stopped believing in movement. They were still advancing on maps, still pushing pins deeper into diagrams, but in truth, they were standing still. The front lines were walls and stairwells, frozen courtyards and shattered workshops. The soldiers measured progress not by distance, but by the number of hours a position could be held before the counterattack came. Every day, the same faces returned to the same ruins. Every night, they listened to the river breathing through the cracks. In those long pauses between artillery bursts, Stalingrad spoke in murmurs, a clatter of debris shifting, the hiss of snow over embers, the low moan of wind through hollow windows. Some men said they could hear voices in it. They called it the whisper of the Volga. It sounded like water talking to ice, like something ancient and patient beneath the noise of war. When it rose at night, even the bravest listened. The cold made everything slower, but it also made everything clearer. The smoke no longer rose straight, it hung low, drifting between ruins like mist. The air bit at exposed skin, drew blood from cracked lips, froze tears before they could fall. Ammunition boxes were pried open with knives stiffened by frost. Rifles jammed when the metal contracted. Even breathing felt like a chore. Yet the fighting did not stop. It only grew quieter, more intimate, more resigned. By November, the Sixth Army numbered hundreds of thousands of men scattered across a city that could no longer be called whole. The Volga marked one edge of their world, the steppe another. Everything between was ruin and endurance. Supplies still arrived, but less often, carried on roads that vanished under snow. Convoys froze where they stood. Horses collapsed in their traces and were butchered for food before they had cooled. The soldiers joked less now. They spoke instead in fragments about warmth, about letters that never came, about the strange stillness of a world made entirely of white and gray. Some nights, they could see faint lights moving on the far bank, Soviet barges creeping across the ice, bringing men and ammunition into the city. The Germans fired flares that hung briefly in the dark like false moons, but most of the time they could only watch. The river, once their goal, had become their boundary. It belonged to someone else now, to the defenders who refused to let it freeze completely, to the wind, to history itself. In the headquarters beneath a ruined department store, General Paulus studied his reports with an expression that never changed. His hands trembled slightly when he held a pencil. The pages told him what he already knew: that fuel was running low, that the wounded were freezing in their beds, that the Luftwaffe could not maintain its promises. Yet the orders from above remained the same: hold the city, no withdrawal, no surrender. He passed the command down the chain, each repetition hollowing it further, until it reached men who could barely stand. Beyond the city, far to the north and south, movements were taking place that none of them could see. Soviet armies were gathering on the steppe, their tanks hidden beneath snowdrifts, their artillery wrapped in camouflage nets. The air was still, the sky low, every sound was muffled by frost. From above, it looked like nothing was happening, just another winter over another battlefield. But beneath that stillness, an encirclement was forming, vast and deliberate, like a storm gathering in silence. Inside Stalingrad, the signs were there if anyone had wanted to see them. Radio contact with the flanks grew uncertain. Outposts reported strange movements at dusk, the sound of engines where no engines should be. Prisoners spoke of new Soviet divisions arriving from the east, of generals named Rokossovsky and Vatutin preparing something large. But in the chain of command, such rumors were absorbed, softened, and forgotten. No one dared to suggest that the hunters might soon become the hunted. The civilians who still lived in the ruins felt the change first. They sensed it in the air, the tension before snow, the weight of silence before thunder. They spoke of a shift in the wind. The Germans, they said, had reached the end of their road. Some of them began to emerge from their cellars at night to scavenge among the rubble, moving like ghosts through the moonlight. They no longer hid from the soldiers. Both sides were too tired to look at each other for long. The city itself seemed to listen. The bombardments came less frequently now, replaced by the steady rhythm of sniper fire and the occasional howl of a shell from far away. Between those sounds, there was the whisper again, the endless, patient murmur of the Volga. It threaded through dreams. Some men said it sounded like the sea, others like music played far underground. A few believed it was calling them home. In truth, it was only the river moving under ice, indifferent to all of them. The first snowstorm came in late November. It swept in from the north, covering trenches and craters in a single night. By morning, the landscape had changed shape. The ruins softened under the white, and the corpses disappeared beneath it. The city looked almost peaceful. For a few hours, the guns fell silent. Then, far away, a new sound rose deep, rolling, rhythmic. Tank engines, dozens of them, then hundreds. The Soviet counteroffensive began like the breaking of a dam. To the north, entire divisions of Red Army armor poured across the frozen steppe, smashing into the Romanian forces that guarded the German flank. In the south, another wave struck the Italians and Hungarians who held the line beyond the city. The defenses, thin and weary, shattered under the weight of it. The Germans inside Stalingrad heard the distant thunder but did not understand. They thought it was just another battle far away. It took days for the truth to reach them that they were no longer the spearhead, but the prey. Within a week, the trap had closed. Two great arms of Soviet steel met west of the city, linking hands around the Sixth Army. The encirclement was complete. Stalingrad was sealed. For the soldiers inside, the realization came slowly. Like dawn behind fog, the roads westward were gone. Supply columns that had left days earlier did not return. The radio filled with static. At first there was disbelief. It was impossible, they said. Then came anger, then silence. The map that had once shown their advance now looked like a noose. Outside, the snow kept falling. The Volga froze thicker. The whisper beneath it grew fainter. The men stood in the ruins and listened, and for the first time in the campaign, the city was truly quiet. No one was moving now, not the living, not the dead, not the river itself. The stillness felt endless. In that silence, the truth finally settled over them. The offensive that had begun with such certainty, the grand drive for oil, for the South, for glory, had reached its final pause. They were cut off. surrounded by an enemy that had learned patience. The men whispered the same word again and again, as if saying it softly might change its meaning. Eingeschlossen encircled. At night, the wind rose again from the east, sweeping snow across the frozen streets. It whistled through the gaps in the walls and over the ice, carrying with it the faint sound of the Volga moving beneath. It was the same whisper as before, only now it sounded like memory, like the voice of something ancient and indifferent, watching the living finish what the land had already decided, and the city listened. The whisper of the Volga never stopped. It moved through the ruins, through the frost, through the hollow hearts of men who had once believed themselves invincible. It whispered of distance, of home, of the quiet truth that even empires, once mighty, eventually fall silent. The encircling storm. At first, it was only a rumor carried by the wind, a whisper that something vast was moving on the steppe. The men of the Sixth Army heard it in fragments, passed from trench to trench, each retelling softer than the last. The Soviets had broken through, some said. Entire divisions had vanished, said others. It seemed impossible. For months, the Wehrmacht had been the hand that shaped the war. Now it was the ground beneath that hand that began to shift. The wind grew stronger. The sky darkened with snow and smoke, and the sound of engines came rolling from beyond the horizon like distant thunder. It was not one sound, but many tanks, trucks, the deep rhythmic clatter of artillery being moved into place. The storm that had been gathering in silence was now awake. The encirclement did not arrive as a single blow. It came as a slow tightening, a series of converging lines that drew inward with perfect, merciless patience. From the north came the forces of General Rokossovsky, cutting through the Romanian armies that guarded the flank like paper. From the south came General Yeremenko's troops, surging through the snow toward Kalash. Between them lay open steppe, white and endless, and in its center, the Sixth Army. The first reports that reached Paulus's headquarters were confused. Communications were patchy, the radios heavy with static. Outposts west of the Don had gone silent. Fuel convoys had vanished. A few messages, short and desperate, broke through. Enemy armor sighted. Heavy losses. Request air support. Then nothing. Paulus read each one in silence. His staff waited for orders, but he said only, "We hold our ground." He still believed the danger was temporary, a breach to be sealed, a counterattack to be launched once reinforcements arrived. The thought of encirclement was unthinkable. Yet even as he spoke, the Soviet pincers were already reaching for each other, moving with the cold precision of a machine. To the men in the field, the change was sudden and absolute. The roads they had used to bring in supplies were now under fire. The horizon that had always meant escape became a wall of smoke. The air smelled of fuel and burning wheat, the last harvests of the steppe consumed by war. Columns of trucks and horse carts tried to retreat west, but the snow turned to sludge beneath the wheels. Soviet aircraft swooped low, dropping bombs that shattered the frozen earth. What had once been the open artery of the advance became a corridor of ruin. Within days, the circle closed. North met south at the town of Kalach on the Don. The trap was perfect, vast enough to contain an entire army, tight enough to choke it. Inside, the Germans and their allies found themselves cut off from the rest of the world. Over 250,000 men, along with tanks, artillery, and thousands of civilians, were now prisoners of the geography they had conquered. In the first hours of realization, disbelief still lingered. Officers spoke of reorganizing, of punching a hole through the ring. The maps on the tables were covered with arrows, but each arrow ended at uncertainty. No one wanted to admit the truth that was slowly crystallizing in the frost, that there was no way out. At night, the steppe glowed faintly with fire. The encircling Soviet armies bombarded the perimeter relentlessly. The sound rolled through the ruins like distant surf. The soldiers inside Stalingrad began to understand what had happened, not through orders or reports, but through silence. The artillery that had once supported them no longer answered their calls. Supply convoys stopped arriving. The roads westward were gone. When they looked to the horizon, they saw the same faint line of smoke in every direction, a ring drawn by fate itself. The shock soon gave way to routine. The Sixth Army reorganized its defenses, converting the city's ruins into strongpoints. What had once been an offensive turned into a siege. The men dug deeper into the frozen soil, building shelters from the debris. Engineers reinforced walls with rubble and steel beams. The airfields outside the city became lifelines, their runways carved through snow and ice. The Luftwaffe promised resupply by air, a promise that would haunt them in the months to come. Within the ruins, life settled into a rhythm of endurance. Each day began with the same gray light, the same hollow hunger, the same distant rumble of Soviet artillery. The soldiers learned to move quietly, to conserve every bullet, every match, every breath. The city had become a maze of cold and smoke. Even the birds had gone, leaving only the sound of boots crunching over snow and the occasional cry of a wounded man echoing between the ruins. For the civilians trapped within, existence was little more than survival. Families huddled in cellars where the air was heavy with frost and smoke. They burned furniture, books, anything that could catch flame. Some shared what food they had with soldiers. Others simply watched in silence, their faces pale as the walls around them. In the darkness, all distinctions blurred. Soldier, worker, child. They were all part of the same quiet tragedy. The Soviet encirclement was not merely physical, it was psychological. The realization that they were alone crept through the ranks like frost. Letters home stopped being written. Commanders no longer promised victory, only endurance. The men began to count days by memory. How long since they had eaten? How long since they had seen sunlight? How long since they had believed the war could still be won? In Berlin, the news was received with disbelief and fury. Hitler refused to accept the reports. He ordered Paulus to hold the city at all costs, to fight to the last bullet, to trust that relief would come. The Sixth Army, he declared, would become an unshakable fortress on the Volga. His words, heavy with conviction, fell into the cold silence of the steppe like stones into a frozen pond. No one there could hear the echo. General Paulus obeyed. He had been trained to follow orders, not to question them. He still hoped that Manstein, the field marshal to the west, could break through with a relief force. That hope was enough to keep the machine running. The men fortified positions, stockpiled ammunition, and prepared for a defense that would soon become their life's final chapter. The Soviets, meanwhile, closed their ring tighter. They did not rush, they waited. Every day, their artillery probed the perimeter, their reconnaissance planes mapping the ruins. They could see the desperation growing inside the pocket, the smoke from makeshift fires, the dwindling movements of vehicles, the empty roads. They did not need to attack yet. Time was already doing their work for them. The cold deepened. The snow hardened into glass. Breath froze in the air. The Volga was now fully icebound, a solid white scar dividing the land. The men could walk on it if they dared, but no one did. The river seemed alive, whispering, shifting, cracking in the night, as though warning anyone who tried to cross. It was no longer the goal of their campaign. It was a mirror showing them what they had become. Still, cold, surrounded by silence. Inside the encirclement, moments of humanity flickered like brief sparks. A soldier shared his last cigarette with another. A medic wrapped a child's hands in torn cloth to keep them from freezing. In the rare pauses between bombardments, the men looked at the snow falling over the ruins and thought of home of fields that were green once, of voices that would never hear their names again. At night, the sky glowed faintly red from distant fires. Some said it was the reflection of the Soviet guns. Others said it was the city itself breathing. The distinction no longer mattered. The front line had dissolved. The battle was everywhere. In early December, Paulus received confirmation of what he had long suspected: the encirclement was total. No relief had yet broken through. The Sixth Army was on its own. He wrote in his diary that night, his handwriting trembling with cold, "We are surrounded. The army stands fast. The Führer believes in us." Then he closed the book and stared at the candle flame until it flickered out. Outside, the snow began again, slow, deliberate, endless. It covered the tracks, the trenches, the dead. It blurred the edges of the world until everything became one color. From the air, Stalingrad was invisible, just another patch of white beneath the vast gray sky. But beneath that calm surface, beneath the frozen skin of the earth, an entire army was waiting, listening to the sound of the encircling storm pressing closer with each passing hour. And through it all, the Volga whispered low, steady, eternal. Its voice carried across the ice and into the ruins, mingling with the breath of men who could no longer imagine escape. The whisper was neither cruel nor kind. It simply was, as it had always been. For centuries it had seen armies come and go, their banners bright one year and forgotten the next. It had carried ships, bodies, and dreams alike. Now it carried only silence. And in that silence lay the truth that what had begun as conquest had become a dirge, and that the empire which had sought to command the earth now listened helplessly to the voice of a frozen river, telling it what all empires eventually learn. That winter, the Volga spoke softly, but its words would echo for generations. The frozen circle. The snow no longer fell in flakes but in whispers, fine, endless, weightless. It drifted across the frozen ruins of Stalingrad, settling on steel and skin with equal indifference. The city, once alive with the roar of engines and the thunder of artillery, now breathed only in faint tremors. Every sound seemed swallowed by the cold. Boots crunched on ice, a shell whined somewhere in the distance and then faded into nothing. The war had not stopped, but it had changed its voice. What had once been fury had become silence, a silence that pressed down upon every heart still beating within the circle. The Sixth Army was no longer an army in the true sense. It was a collection of scattered groups, divisions reduced to handfuls, battalions turned to whispers of what they once were. The maps in Paulus's command post still showed neat lines and arrows, but they were lies written on frozen paper. The front was everywhere and nowhere. Streets that had been taken and retaken a dozen times now lay buried beneath snow and corpses. The living moved among them carefully, as if afraid to wake the dead. Each day was the same, a rhythm of exhaustion that had replaced the logic of battle. Morning came late, a dim gray light that filtered through clouds so heavy they seemed to rest upon the rooftops. Men woke from uneasy sleep, if they had slept at all, and felt the ache in their bones before they even opened their eyes. Frost rimed their blankets, rifles lay stiff beside them. They lit small fires from scraps of wood or broken furniture, their hands trembling from hunger more than cold. The flames burned blue and thin, casting long shadows that looked like ghosts against the walls. Breakfast, when there was any, consisted of a crust of bread shared among three, or a spoonful of soup made from melted snow, and whatever could be boiled in it, flour, horse meat, sometimes nothing at all. Then they went back to their posts, back to the ruins, back to the waiting. The waiting, that was what defined Stalingrad now. Waiting for food, for orders, for relief that would never come. Waiting for the next shell to fall, or the next voice to go quiet. The Luftwaffe had promised to supply the encircled army by air, and for a few days, the sky had seemed alive again with the sound of engines. Men lifted their heads when they heard the distant drone of Ju-52 seconds and Heinkel transports. They watched them appear through the clouds like silver birds, their wings glinting faintly in the weak sun. Parachutes bloomed across the sky, white, green, gray, fluttering down like strange snowflakes. For a moment, there was hope. But hope was a fragile thing in Stalingrad. The wind scattered the parachutes. Many fell into Soviet lines. Others carried nothing more than bandages or boots. The fuel and ammunition never came in the amounts needed. The airfields were under constant attack, their runways cratered and frozen. Pilots wrote that they had seen the city beneath them, a gray scar twisting along the river, and that even from the air it looked dead. By the end of the first week, everyone inside the circle knew what the numbers meant, that no airlift could save them. The rations grew smaller. The silence grew longer. Hunger changed men faster than bullets. It stole their faces first, hollowed the cheeks, dulled the eyes, turned them into strangers who still wore the same uniforms. Their movements became slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial. They spoke less and stared more. They stopped counting the days. Bread became a currency, a memory, a religion. Some dreamed of it at night, soft, warm, endless. Others tried to chew frozen leather straps or boiled shavings from the soles of their boots. When horses died, they were not buried. Their flesh was cut, shared, traded. Even that did not last long. By January, there were no more horses left. In the hospitals, the air was thick with the smell of decay and disinfectant. Tents and cellars overflowed with the wounded men with frostbitten limbs, with shrapnel wounds that had turned black, with eyes that no longer closed even in sleep. The doctors worked with what they had: vodka, rags, courage. Sometimes there were no bandages, and wounds were wrapped in paper. There was no morphine left. The screams that echoed through those rooms were muffled by the snow outside. The nurses moved between the cots without speaking. They had stopped writing names weeks ago. It no longer mattered who anyone had been. At night, the cold deepened until it became something alive, a force that crept into lungs and froze breath mid-sentence. The stars hung low and bright, sharp as ice. Men huddled together for warmth, their bodies pressed close in the ruins of factories and houses. The wind sang through the broken windows, and the Volga groaned beneath its frozen shell. Sometimes, the soldiers said the sound of the river was like whispering voices, not enemy voices, but the dead calling softly from beneath the ice. They would listen for a while, then fall asleep with their rifles across their chests, the whispering fading into dreams. Command still functioned, at least in form. Paulus sat at his desk under a hanging lamp that swung faintly in the draft. Reports came in constantly, though they no longer meant much. Fuel, gone. Ammunition, nearly gone. Rations, 3 days' supply at best. The generals spoke in calm tones, as if calm could change arithmetic. They drew lines on maps and discussed counterattacks that would never happen. They spoke of relief of Manstein's army advancing from the west. The name itself became a kind of talisman. Manstein is coming. Hold a little longer. It passed from bunker to bunker, from trench to trench, shrinking as it went until it became little more than a whisper: someone is coming. But no one came. The Soviets had learned patience. They no longer stormed the city in great waves. They tightened the ring instead, drawing closer yard by yard, day by day. Artillery fire became methodical, measured, almost merciful in its predictability. Shells landed like a heartbeat. The Red Army dug in along the outskirts, its soldiers watching through scopes and binoculars as their enemies faded before their eyes. Some of them felt pity, most did not. For months they had bled in the ruins of their own homes. Now the balance had shifted, and they understood that victory was no longer a matter of bravery, but of time. Time that was the real enemy inside the circle. It froze fingers, silenced engines, emptied bellies. It turned men into shadows long before death claimed them. Even the city seemed to age with them. The walls sagged, the streets vanished under ice, the ruins grew still. Once, Stalingrad had been a place of machines and movement, of smoke and fire. Now it was a graveyard of sound. The last radios crackled with static, transmitting fragments of messages that no longer had meaning. Hold position. Air support delayed. Supplies expected tomorrow. But tomorrow was a word that had lost its shape. Every dawn looked the same. There were moments when memory broke through the monotony, small, human flashes that refused to die. A soldier found a piano in the rubble of a school and played a few frozen notes with gloved fingers until a sniper's bullet ended the song. Another wrote a letter he could never send, describing the beauty of the snow at sunrise. A medic carved a small wooden cross from a splintered rifle stock and left it on the chest of a boy he could not save. Each act was both defiance and surrender, proof that the human spirit still flickered in the storm, even as the storm tried to erase it. By mid-December, the Sixth Army was no longer fighting an enemy. It was fighting hunger, cold, and itself. Discipline began to fray. Men wandered between units searching for food. Some deserted their posts to scavenge among the dead. Others simply sat down and refused to move again. The officers tried to maintain order, but authority meant little in a place where survival was the only command. Paulus continued to issue directives from his bunker, his voice steady, his uniform immaculate. But the army he addressed was dissolving into frost and silence. Outside the city, the Soviets began their final preparations. Operation Ring. They called it the closing of the circle. They built artillery positions, lined up tanks, and waited for the coldest days of January. The generals wanted to end it cleanly, to crush the pocket and move on. Yet even they spoke in quiet tones when they looked toward the city. There was something about that place, the smoke, the stillness, the enormity of what had happened there that silenced even victory. Inside the ruins, the nights grew longer, the fires burned lower. Some men began to talk to the dead, as if conversation could keep them company. Others walked into the snow and never came back. The living envied the stillness of those who no longer felt the cold. And yet, somewhere in that vast white circle of despair, there remained a strange, stubborn dignity. The soldiers still stood when ordered to. They still saluted their officers. They still called each other camarade. They still believed, somewhere deep beneath the hunger and the frost, that they had done their duty. It was a belief as fragile and pure as the snow itself. When dawn came on the last day of the year, it brought no sound but the wind. The sun rose pale and distant, barely touching the horizon. For a few moments, the frozen ruins of Stalingrad glowed faintly, like glass catching light. Then the clouds closed again, and the light was gone. The men watched it fade, and no one spoke. They knew that the new year would bring no change. The circle had closed, and they were its center. The world beyond it had already moved on. Somewhere far away, trains were moving west, carrying new divisions, new orders, new dreams. But inside the circle, time had stopped. The Sixth Army existed outside of it, now a frozen monument to ambition, courage, and blindness. They had come to claim a city, and instead, they had built a tomb. The Volga, still whispering under ice, was their witness. Its voice carried softly through the ruins, across the snow, over the bones of the living and the dead alike. It spoke of the futility of conquest, of the patience of the land, of the quiet way in which history forgets even the loudest wars. By January, the whisper was all that remained. The guns spoke rarely now. The wind spoke more. The soldiers listened. Some thought it sounded like water, others like a lullaby sung by a world that no longer needed them. Perhaps it was both. The circle was complete. The storm had passed. What remained was stillness, endless, unbroken, eternal. And in that frozen stillness, the empire that had reached for the horizon finally heard the truth it had been running from since the first day of summer, that no army, no ideology, no dream of power could outlast the winter, and that even the mightiest men eventually fall silent beneath the snow. Encircled souls, the new year arrived without celebration. There were no songs, no toasts, no laughter echoing through the ruins. Only the wind moved slow and ceaseless, sweeping across the shattered city like a hand erasing what little warmth remained. The soldiers did not mark the passing of time anymore. Days and nights bled into each other like smoke dissolving in the air. The men who still wore watches had stopped winding them. There was no meaning in minutes when the hours themselves were frozen. By now, Stalingrad was less a battlefield and more a frozen world, suspended between life and memory. The snow had buried the shapes of streets and the outlines of buildings, softening even the wreckage into silence. What had once been a city of brick and iron had turned into a white wasteland, where only the ruins of chimneys and the skeletons of factories broke the horizon. Beneath this frozen crust, an entire army lay hidden, men who still breathed, still dreamed, still fought to remember who they were. Inside their bunkers, the soldiers spoke little. Their voices had become hoarse from cold air and rationed words. The rhythm of their lives was reduced to necessity. Wake, shiver, search for food, repair weapons, wait for orders. Every movement required effort, every breath visible in the dim light of candles made from wax scraped off crates. The fires burned low, smoke curled lazily across ceilings blackened by soot. When the wind blew through cracks in the walls, the flames wavered, like the heartbeat of something dying but not yet dead. The food situation had grown beyond desperate. Even the memory of hunger had changed. It was no longer sharp or unbearable. It was dull, constant, like a stone pressing against the inside of the body. The rations were little more than an illusion of sustenance, a handful of flour mixed with water, or a scrap of frozen meat that might once have been horse, dog, or something no one cared to name. Men chewed slowly, savoring texture more than taste. They closed their eyes when they ate, pretending for a moment they were home, in warmth, surrounded by voices that still remembered them. Letters from home had stopped long ago. The last ones had arrived weeks earlier, dropped from the sky with the failing airlifts, tiny fragments of a distant world, written in ink that had already faded. Some men carried them like talismans, folded and unfolded until the paper tore. Others buried them in the snow, too painful to read again. The words were full of normal things: harvests, children, music, the smell of rain. They belonged to another universe, one that no longer existed. The men inside Stalingrad were ghosts of that world, wandering among its ruins, unseen and already half forgotten. At the command post, Paulus had stopped pretending. He still wore his uniform immaculate, still issued orders, but his voice had lost conviction. The papers on his desk multiplied like snowdrifts, reports of frostbite, of missing fuel, of ammunition that no longer fired. He received daily messages from Hitler, each one demanding that the army hold firm, that Stalingrad must never surrender. The words arrived like stones, heavy and meaningless. Paulus read them, nodded, and said little. He was a man trapped not just by enemy lines, but by the shadow of obedience. Somewhere in his mind, he still believed that help would come, but each passing day made belief a smaller and smaller thing. Beyond the headquarters, the city was dying by degrees. Frost crept through every crevice, turning weapons brittle and lungs raw. The dead no longer shocked anyone. They were part of the landscape now, silent companions in the trenches, sitting where they had fallen, their faces softened by snow. Some soldiers spoke to them in whispers. Others avoided looking at them altogether, yet there was no horror left in it, only familiarity. Death had become a neighbor who visited so often that his presence no longer startled. The Soviets, watching from the outer rings, could see what was happening through their binoculars. The once feared German army had become motionless. Fires burned weakly in the ruins, but few patrols moved. There were no more counterattacks, no sudden bursts of defiance. The Red Army had encircled not only men, but time itself. Stalin's generals understood that victory was inevitable now. There was no need for haste. They simply waited and watched, as the circle tightened invisibly each day, as the breath of the trapped army grew shallower. Within the city, reality began to blur. Cold and hunger played tricks on the mind. Men saw things that were not there, the outline of trees in the snow, the shimmer of rivers that did not exist. Some swore they heard music drifting across the steppe at night, as if the world beyond the Volga was still alive and laughing. Others said they saw the lights of friendly columns approaching, shimmering on the horizon like mirages. They ran toward them sometimes, only to find emptiness and wind. The body failed first, but the mind soon followed, drifting between memory and frost. A young corporal named Eric wrote in his notebook, "The snow never ends. It falls inside me now. I cannot tell if I am still here, or if I have already gone." His words, found later among the ruins, captured the feeling of those days more than any report could. The men of the Sixth Army were not only surrounded by the enemy, they were surrounded by silence, by the slow erasure of meaning. The city was no longer a place but a state of mind, a vast frozen echo chamber where even thoughts seemed to crystallize before they could take shape. The Luftwaffe still tried to reach them. Planes came when the weather allowed, their engines distant, uncertain. The soldiers would look up instinctively, squinting into the white sky, hoping to see the small black dots descending through the clouds, but more often than not, the sky was empty. When supplies did fall, The soldiers raced toward them across open ground, dodging artillery fire. Many were killed not by the enemy, but by desperation, shot or shelled, as they tried to recover sacks of flour or crates of ammunition. The air itself had become another battlefield. Inside the bunkers, talk of surrender began to surface like smoke. It started in low voices, then grew bolder as days passed. Some officers argued that it was the only honorable path left to save what remained of their men. Others clung to orders, to the illusion of duty, to the ghost of an empire that demanded obedience even in ruin. The debates always ended the same way, in silence. There was nothing left to decide. At night, the city glowed faintly beneath the snow. Fires smoldered under the ice, their light leaking through cracks like embers beneath glass. The wind carried the smell of fuel, smoke, and frozen blood. The stars, when visible, seemed closer now, sharp and cold enough to touch. The soldiers looked at them sometimes and wondered if anyone was looking back, if the sky still belonged to the same world as the one they had left behind. For a moment, in that endless winter, even the universe felt small. In the final weeks of January, the circle grew tighter still. Soviet artillery now reached every corner of the pocket. Shells fell with monotonous rhythm, collapsing walls already half ruined, scattering men who no longer had the strength to run. The hospitals were overflowing. The wounded lay in rows upon the floor, wrapped in torn uniforms. A doctor wrote, "I have amputated 30 limbs today. My hands do not shake anymore." Another simply recorded, "Morphine none, bandages none, faith none." Yet still they worked, cutting, binding, praying without words. Paulus received one final message from Hitler, congratulating him on his promotion to field marshal. It was meant as an honor, but everyone understood what it meant. No German field marshal had ever surrendered. The implication was clear: he was to die there, with his army. Paulus stared at the message for a long time before folding it away. He said nothing. Around him, his staff stood in silence, understanding that history had just closed its hand around them. As the last days approached, the world seemed to narrow to a single point: the here, the now, the small circle of light inside a bunker, the sound of distant guns, the cold breath of the Volga pressing against the walls. Men who had once marched with songs and banners now whispered prayers. They spoke of families, of food, of warmth. Some still believed that rescue would come, most no longer cared. They only wanted the noise to stop, the waiting to end, the snow to cover everything, and make it quiet again. When the Soviets finally advanced, they did so with care, as though approaching something sacred in its ruin. They met little resistance. The German positions collapsed like hollow shells, the defenders too weak to fight, their rifles frozen in their hands. In some cellars, entire groups were found sitting upright, eyes open, as if still keeping watch over a war that had already ended. The air was thick with stillness. Even the victors spoke softly as they walked through the wreckage, their boots crunching over ice and memory alike. Stalingrad had become a monument not of triumph or defeat, but of endurance and loss. Every brick, every broken window, every silent room held a story that would outlive its tellers. The men who had fought there, German, Soviet, civilian alike, were now bound together in a single narrative written in snow and blood. The city no longer belonged to anyone. It belonged to time. And through it all, the Volga kept flowing beneath its frozen skin, unseen but unceasing. Beneath the ice, the water moved with quiet strength, carrying fragments of the city downstream, ashes, splinters, and perhaps the last echoes of human voices. Its whisper reached the edges of the steppe, gentle and patient, as if promising that even the coldest winters would one day thaw. But for those trapped within the frozen circle, that spring would never come. They had come to conquer, and instead, they had been conquered not by an enemy, but by the weight of history itself. The circle had closed not just around an army, but around an era, marking the point where ambition froze, and humanity stood still beneath the falling snow. The silence before the collapse. The city had grown quieter than ever. Even the artillery seemed to pause, as though the very act of destruction had grown tired. Snow covered everything, the ruins, the weapons, the men, softening the sharpness of war until it resembled peace. From a distance, Stalingrad looked almost serene, a white wound stitched shut by winter. But beneath that still surface, life clung on in fragile breaths and fading whispers. Inside the bunkers, the last candles burned low. The wax had been melted and reused so many times that the flames were small and trembling, like memories trying not to die. The air smelled of oil, smoke, and exhaustion. Men sat in silence, their faces pale and thin, their eyes hollow but calm. There was no fear anymore, no shouting, no plans for counterattacks or miracles. Only waiting. Waiting for something that had already begun, the quiet surrender of strength, the slow surrender of hope. The wind outside carried no voices now. It swept over the snowdrifts and through the empty streets, rattling bits of metal and tattered cloth that once had been flags. The Soviet bombardments came less frequently, measured and methodical, like the ticking of a clock marking the final hours of an empire. Each explosion was distant, deliberate, and followed by long stretches of nothing, long enough for a man to hear his own heartbeat and wonder how much longer it would continue. In the command post, Paulus sat surrounded by silence. The radio crackled occasionally with static, but no clear messages came through. The circuits froze, the batteries died, and the world outside his walls might as well have been on another planet. Reports still trickled in from the front, scribbled in pencil on scraps of paper, fragments of a language that no longer described anything real. Fuel exhausted, ammunition almost gone. Enemy approaching from the north. He read them without emotion. Each sentence was the same as the last. His officers stood around him like shadows, wrapped in blankets and greatcoats, waiting for decisions that no longer mattered. Some stared at the floor, others at the map spread across the table, its lines blurred by candlelight. The front, the flanks, the river, all meaningless now. The encirclement had erased geography. There was only here, and there was only now. Paulus rubbed his temples and spoke softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. "The army will hold as long as possible," he said, though he knew the words carried no weight. No one answered. They all knew that as long as possible meant only a few more days. The men still fighting in the outer districts had stopped thinking in terms of orders. They fought because they were there, because the act of holding a rifle felt like the last link to who they once were. They moved through the ruins like sleepwalkers, their uniforms stiff with frost, their boots worn to rags. The cold had made their fingers numb, but their movements remained precise, almost ritualistic. Every bullet fired was an act of remembrance, every breath a form of resistance against disappearing entirely. At night, when the artillery fell silent, the city seemed to listen to itself. The creaking of wood, the sigh of snow sliding off rooftops, the faint murmur of the frozen river beneath the ice, these became the sounds of existence. Men spoke in whispers, if at all. They shared what remained of their rations, a crust of bread broken with deliberate slowness, as though the act of sharing could delay the inevitable. They spoke of home, of forests and fields, of the smell of summer rain. But the words felt far away, like stories told to them by strangers. In one ruined factory, a group of soldiers had built a small fire in a metal drum. They sat around it, the flickering light turning their faces golden for a few moments. One of them, a young sergeant, held a piece of paper close to the flame. It was a photograph, a woman and a child standing in front of a garden gate. The edges of the paper had already curled from heat, but he did not let it burn. He only stared at it, the way a drowning man might look at the surface above him. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "She would have turned 5 this winter." No one answered. The others stared into the fire. Outside, the wind whispered against the walls, and the snow began to fall again. The Luftwaffe had stopped coming. For days, no engines had broken the horizon, no parachutes had drifted down like strange, silent birds. The sky was empty. The last message from the airlift units had promised a final drop, but it never came. The Sixth Army had become invisible to the world, an island of silence in a sea of cold. The men looked up sometimes, out of habit, but saw only clouds moving slowly across the sky. Even hope had grown tired. The Soviets, encircling the city, knew the end was near. They moved closer with each passing day, tightening the noose. Their artillery fire grew more focused, their advances more measured. Prisoners captured on the outskirts spoke of starvation and despair inside the German lines. The Red Army soldiers listened in silence, nodding slowly. Many of them had fought in Stalingrad's ruins months before, when the Germans had seemed unstoppable. Now the balance had reversed, but victory brought no joy. The scale of suffering on both sides had erased triumph. The Soviets advanced not as conquerors but as witnesses to the cost of endurance. Inside the ruins, the hospitals were overflowing. Men lay shoulder to shoulder on the frozen floors, their bodies wrapped in blankets, their eyes fixed on the low ceilings above. Some prayed aloud, others simply stared. The doctors had stopped keeping records. There was no more paper and no more reason. They worked until their hands bled, then stopped, not because the work was done, but because it was pointless to continue. The wounded no longer cried out. Pain had become too familiar for sound. Somewhere near the tractor factory, a shell struck a basement filled with refugees and soldiers sheltering together. When the dust cleared, those who survived found themselves in absolute darkness. For hours, they waited, calling softly into the blackness. The voices grew fewer as time passed. When rescuers finally reached them the next day, the air inside was thick with frost and silence. The survivors blinked at the daylight as though it were a stranger. One of them whispered, "I thought we were already dead." By the end of January, the Sixth Army had ceased to exist as an organized force. What remained were clusters of men, isolated and exhausted, holding small patches of ground that had long since lost meaning. Paulus received orders from Hitler to fight to the last man. He read them in the dim light of his bunker and placed them on the table without a word. The officers around him waited for him to speak. He did not. There was nothing left to command. Outside, the snow fell soundlessly against the windows, and the candles burned lower. When the Soviets finally launched their last offensive, it came almost gently. Their tanks rolled forward through the drifts, engines muffled by snow. Artillery fire swept ahead of them, not furious but steady, as though marking a final boundary rather than a conquest. Resistance was scattered and brief. In some sectors, German soldiers emerged from their bunkers with hands raised, too weak to speak. Others simply sat where they were, waiting to be found. The Red Army soldiers moved cautiously among them, their rifles lowered. They saw faces pale as marble, eyes sunken, bodies wrapped in rags. Some of the Germans tried to salute, but their arms trembled and fell. There was no fight left in them, only the quiet dignity of men who had endured too much. At Paulus's headquarters, the last decision was made in near silence. Surrounded by his remaining officers, he received the Soviet envoy who demanded surrender. Paulus listened as the interpreter spoke, his eyes fixed on a spot on the wall. When the message was finished, he nodded once. "Tell them we will comply." The words were simple, almost gentle. There was no ceremony, no drama, just release, a moment when the weight of months lifted and left only emptiness behind. The news spread slowly through the ruins. Some men wept. Others simply sat down and closed their eyes. A few tried to burn their papers, their flags, their insignia, as if erasing the symbols could ease the memory, but the snow smothered the flames. Everywhere there was quiet. The guns stopped. The air itself seemed to pause. After so many months of noise, the sudden stillness felt unnatural, even frightening. When the Soviet troops finally entered the heart of the city, they found no defenders waiting for them, only silence, broken by the crunch of their boots on the snow. In cellars and shelters, they discovered men sitting upright, frozen where they had died, their faces calm, as if sleeping. Others stood blinking in the light, unable to speak. The war, for them, had already ended long before, and so the city that had consumed two armies at last fell silent. Stalingrad, the symbol of conquest and defiance, had become a place of ghosts. The snow continued to fall, covering the tracks of men, tanks, and dreams alike. The Volga flowed beneath its frozen surface, carrying fragments of ice toward the distant sea. Its voice was soft now, almost kind, as if whispering a lullaby to those who had finally stopped fighting. The silence before the collapse had become the collapse itself, not with a shout, but with a breath, fading into the cold air of history. The surrender morning came without color. A gray light settled over the city like a shroud, neither dawn nor day. Snow had stopped falling during the night, leaving the air strangely still. It was as if the wind itself had grown weary of the struggle and chosen silence. From the Volga to the western steppe, the world was quiet. Smoke drifted upward from smoldering ruins, pale against the cold horizon. Stalingrad had ceased to be a battlefield. It was now a frozen monument, a cathedral of stillness built from ash and sorrow. The surrender did not begin with words. It began with a feeling, the moment when men who had fought for months realized there was nothing left to fight for. No ammunition, no food, no orders that could change the inevitable. In the trenches, soldiers looked at one another without speaking. Their rifles hung useless across their shoulders. The frost clung to their eyelashes like glass dust. Somewhere, a single shot echoed, but it sounded out of place, a sound from another time. Then even that faded. The last command had been given: do nothing. At headquarters, Field Marshal Paulus stood beside a window, his breath fogging the glass. Beyond it stretched the ruins of what had once been a city. The buildings nearest were blackened shells, the streets indistinguishable beneath drifts of snow and debris. He could see figures moving slowly in the distance. German soldiers, some still wearing their helmets, others bareheaded, their movements uncertain, almost peaceful. They were walking toward the enemy lines, their hands empty. It looked, he thought, less like defeat and more like surrender to winter itself. Inside the bunker, the air was heavy and cold. The walls trembled occasionally from distant artillery, though the shelling had grown half-hearted, sporadic, a habit more than a weapon. Paulus turned as a Soviet officer was led in by his adjutant. The man saluted stiffly, then spoke through an interpreter. The message was short, delivered without malice. The German Sixth Army was to lay down its arms immediately. Any further resistance would bring unnecessary suffering. Paulus nodded slowly. He did not argue. There was nothing left to argue for. He asked for paper, signed the document, and set his pen aside. The sound of it clicking against the table was the only sound in the room. History had turned its page with that small, soft sound. For a long moment, no one moved. Then one of the officers crossed himself. Another lowered his head. The rest stood in silence, as though afraid that words might disturb the fragile peace that had descended. Outside, the first Soviet units were entering the outer districts, their boots crunching on snow layered with the debris of months. They moved carefully, rifles lowered, faces unreadable. There was no cheer, no celebration, only the disciplined rhythm of men who had seen too much to take pleasure in victory. Across the ruins, the news spread in murmurs. "It's over." The phrase passed from mouth to mouth, first uncertain, then certain, until it was everywhere. Men who had survived bombardments and starvation now wept quietly, not from relief or shame, but from exhaustion. Others sat down where they stood, as if their bodies had been held upright only by the momentum of duty and could now finally rest. Some took off their helmets and placed them gently in the snow, a gesture that felt both reverent and final. Soviet troops encountered them in clusters, pale, emaciated soldiers, emerging from cellars, from broken buildings, from holes dug in the ice. Their faces were gray, their lips cracked and bleeding. Many no longer recognized the language of command. They raised their hands instinctively, unsure if they were surrendering to men or to fate. Some smiled faintly when offered bread, others simply stared, as if food were something they had forgotten how to desire. The surrender of an army is never a single moment, but a cascade. It moves outward like thawing ice, one unit laying down arms after another, each gesture weakening the next line of resistance. In Stalingrad, it was less a cascade than a quiet unraveling. By midday, the northern pocket had gone still. In the south, scattered fighting continued for a few hours longer, not from defiance, but from confusion. Some units had not received the word, others did not believe it. But as Soviet Dishon and Deleter, loudspeakers carried the message through the streets, calm voices in Russian and German, urging the soldiers to come out. The last bursts of gunfire faded. The echoes lingered a moment, then were swallowed by snow. The Red Army advanced methodically, not as conquerors, but as caretakers of what remained. They found weapons stacked neatly in corners, rifles leaning against walls, machine guns frozen in place. In some cellars, German soldiers stood at attention, waiting to be taken prisoner. In others, they lay on the floor beside their comrades, the line between the living and the dead blurred by stillness. Soviet medics worked side by side with German doctors, tending to those who could still be saved. For a few brief hours, the war seemed suspended, replaced by the simple act of keeping men alive. When Paulus was escorted from his headquarters, the world outside felt strangely distant. The cold struck him like a wall. His boots crunched in the snow as he stepped into the open. Around him, Soviet soldiers watched silently. No one jeered, no one spoke. A photographer raised a camera. The click of the shutter was almost delicate. It captured not triumph, but the weary dignity of a man whose will had reached its limit. Paulus climbed into a waiting truck without looking back. Behind him, the command post stood quiet, its doors swinging open in the wind. As the day wore on, thousands of prisoners filled the streets, columns stretching for miles, their lines marked by silence. They moved slowly, their breath clouding the air, their footsteps leaving shallow impressions in the snow. Some carried wounded comrades between them, others supported each other by the elbows, moving as one body. The Soviets herded them gently but firmly, guiding them toward collection points near the river. For many, it was the first time in months they had seen open space, unobstructed by ruins. The horizon seemed impossibly wide, almost merciful, but beyond that horizon lay Siberia, and for most of them, the long road to captivity would never end. Among the captives were Romanians, Italians, Hungarians, the remnants of an entire coalition that had followed Germany into the east. They no longer marched under flags or ranks. Hunger and frost had erased those distinctions. They were all the same now, men moving through a landscape that no longer cared who had been victor or vanquished. Some tried to speak to their captors, offering cigarettes, watches, whatever remained. The Soviets accepted little, answering mostly with nods. War had stripped language down to gestures. By evening, the sun dipped low behind a haze of smoke. Fires glowed faintly in the distance, not from battle, but from soldiers burning wreckage for warmth. The Volga lay frozen and silent, its surface reflecting the dull red of the sky. Along its banks, Soviet officers stood watching as the columns of prisoners crossed the city. One of them, a young lieutenant, wrote later in his diary, "I saw them come out of the ruins like ghosts. There was no hatred left in me, only pity and a strange peace." The next days blurred together. The Soviets counted what remained. 91,000 prisoners, 1,600 officers, 24 generals. Among them, Paulus himself, the first German field marshal ever taken alive. For Germany, it was unthinkable. For the world, it was revelation. The myth of invincibility had cracked, and through that crack, something larger began to move, the slow turning of the war's tide. But inside Stalingrad, those numbers meant nothing. The city itself was gone. Its streets were unrecognizable, its people scattered or dead. The ruins stretched in every direction, a labyrinth of frozen steel and shattered stone. Dogs wandered through the rubble, silent and thin. Crows perched on the skeletons of tanks, their cries sharp against the quiet. Everywhere there was the smell of smoke, of burned oil, of winter and death. The snow tried to cover it, but even snow could not hide the memory of what had happened here. For the prisoners, the journey east began almost immediately. They were marched through the ruins in long lines, guarded by Red Army soldiers who walked with rifles slung loosely over their shoulders. The Germans stumbled through the snow, some barefoot, some wrapped in torn blankets. The sound of their boots was rhythmic, hypnotic, the sound of an army dissolving into history. At night, they were kept in open fields or burned-out warehouses, huddled together for warmth. Frost claimed dozens before morning. Yet even among them, there were moments of strange tenderness. A Soviet guard sharing a crust of bread, a prisoner thanking him with a trembling hand, both too tired for hatred. Back in Berlin, the news struck like thunder. Hitler refused to believe it at first. He raged, shouted, demanded explanations. But the reality was undeniable. His greatest army had been destroyed, his most trusted general captured. Propaganda tried to shape the story into one of martyrdom. The Sixth Army had fought to the last breath. But the truth was quieter, more human, and far more enduring. They had fought until there was nothing left to fight with, and then they had stopped. For the Soviet Union, Stalingrad became more than victory. It became faith-restored proof that even the strongest invader could be broken. Across the nation, bells rang, songs were written, mothers wept. The name of the city, once synonymous with suffering, became a symbol of endurance. But the men who had fought there on both sides carried its silence with them forever. They had lived through something beyond glory or defeat, something that no anthem could describe. When February came, the snow began to soften. The ice on the river cracked and sighed, and the first meltwater ran in narrow streams through the ruins. It carried with it the ashes of what had been fragments of paper, bits of cloth, the small, unrecognizable remnants of 1,000 dreams. Stalingrad began to thaw, but its memory would never warm. The surrender had ended the battle, yet it had also begun something larger. The slow realization that war itself was changing, that even empires could bleed, that human endurance had limits no ideology could overcome. And so, the story of Stalingrad closed not with an explosion, but with a whisper, the sound of surrender carried by the wind. It was the sound of boots fading into distance, of papers rustling in the cold, of water moving beneath the ice. It was the voice of history saying softly, "Enough." The city would rise again, in time, rebuilt brick by brick, its scars hidden beneath new walls. But beneath those walls, the silence of the Sixth Army would remain an echo, eternal, like the murmur of the Volga in winter. For those who survived, every snowfall would carry that memory, the day when war itself grew still, and men learned that even the fiercest ambition can end in quiet. Stalingrad had surrendered not only to the enemy, but to time, to truth, to the weight of all things mortal. And in that surrender, the world changed. The long road east. The battle had ended, but for the men who survived Stalingrad, the war was not over. It had only changed its shape. The guns were silent now, yet the sound of war lingered in their bones, the dull ringing in their ears, the memory of shells falling, the weight of months spent beneath frozen skies. They were no longer soldiers of the Sixth Army. They were prisoners, bound for a land they could not imagine, walking away from a city that had already become a ghost. The march began at dawn. A pale sun hung low over the ruins, casting long shadows across the snow. The air was sharp enough to sting with every breath. Soviet guards moved among the prisoners, speaking in low tones, urging them into columns. There was no shouting, no cruelty at first, only efficiency. A quiet rhythm of movement. The prisoners stumbled into lines that stretched as far as the eye could see, dark threads winding through a white world. Behind them, Stalingrad lay silent, its smoke rising like thin gray ribbons into the frozen air. No one looked back for long. To look back was to see what could not be changed. Their boots made a soft, steady sound, half muffled by snow, step after step, hour after hour. The rhythm of survival had changed from firing rifles to simply keeping upright. Men who had once commanded tanks and divisions now walked with heads bowed, their breath clouding before them, their greatcoats stiff with frost. Hunger gnawed at them still. Many had eaten nothing since the day before the surrender. But now even hunger felt distant, dulled by exhaustion, by the numbness that settled over both body and mind. The The Soviets led them eastward, away from the Volga, away from the battlefields, across an endless steppe that shimmered white under the pale sun. The landscape seemed to have no edge, no sound but the wind. It was beautiful in its desolation, like an ocean frozen mid-wave. Yet to those walking across it, it felt infinite, merciless. There were no markers, no signposts, only the faint trail left by those who walked ahead. Every few miles, the column paused. Some prisoners sank to their knees and did not rise again. The guards would stop, sometimes helping them to their feet, sometimes leaving them where they fell. There was no time to count the dead. The first nights were the worst. The prisoners were herded into makeshift camps, ruined barns, shattered villages, open fields with nothing but the stars above. Fires were rare. There was little wood and too many men. They huddled together for warmth, breath mingling in the air, frost forming on their blankets and faces. The cold was alive, a presence that crept through their clothes, their skin, their very thoughts. Men slept in bursts, waking to find their neighbors stiff and silent beside them. When morning came, they moved again, leaving behind shapes in the snow that no one buried. Somewhere among them marched officers and generals, their medals long since hidden, their pride stripped away by necessity. They no longer gave orders. Rank had melted in the cold like everything else. A general might walk beside a private, sharing a crust of bread, leaning on the same stick for balance. The old divisions of command and obedience had no meaning on this road. All were equal, now equal in hunger, equal in weariness, equal in the quiet dignity of survival. There were acts of kindness still, small and fleeting but real. A Soviet guard offering a piece of bread to a shivering prisoner, a German soldier lifting a wounded comrade onto a sled made from a broken door, men sharing stories in broken languages, discovering that silence was their only common tongue. In those moments, war seemed far away, replaced by something simpler, the recognition of another human being moving beside you through the cold. But for many, the journey became a blur. Days bled into one another, marked only by distance and loss. The cold was constant, the sky unchanging. Some prisoners sang quietly to keep themselves awake, old folk songs, hymns, fragments of melody remembered from childhood. Their voices were hoarse and thin, carried away by the wind almost as soon as they began. Others marched in silence, their thoughts turned inward. They imagined their homes, their families, the warmth of kitchens, the smell of bread. These visions became both comfort and torment, flickering like lanterns in the fog. The Soviets called the destination Lager Camp. No one knew where it was or how far. Rumors spread like snowflakes, impossible to hold. Some said the camps were near the Urals. Others said Siberia, a word that sounded as distant as the moon. It did not matter. The road itself was endless enough. The men began to measure time in footsteps rather than hours, in the distance between one breath and the next. As they moved farther east, the terrain changed. The wind grew harsher, the snow deeper. Villages appeared now and then, small clusters of wooden houses half buried in drifts. The villagers watched in silence as the columns passed. Some offered water, a few loaves of bread. Others turned away, faces hard with memory. They had seen too many armies come and go, too much death wrapped in foreign uniforms. To them, this procession of pale ghosts was only another winter passing through. For the prisoners, thirst became as cruel as cold. The snow could not be eaten without consequence. It froze the tongue and stomach, leaving a deeper ache behind. They melted it in their hands when they could, swallowing slowly. Food came irregularly: thin soup, a few boiled potatoes, black bread rationed by the handful. The men ate with reverence, every crumb precious. Sometimes the guards shared their own rations, knowing the prisoners would not survive otherwise. Compassion flickered quietly in those places where hatred had already burned itself out. Paulus himself was transported separately, guarded but not mistreated. He spoke little, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Those who saw him said he looked not broken, but hollowed, as though the war had carved him out from within, leaving only the shell of a man once certain of his destiny. He was taken westward first, to be questioned, then east again, toward captivity in Moscow. His name would survive, but the man behind it had already faded into history's background. One figure among tens of thousands now trudging through snow. The columns stretched for miles. At dusk, when the sun dipped behind the white hills, the shadows of the men grew long and fragile, merging with the twilight. From afar, they looked like a single dark river flowing eastward, slow, heavy, inevitable. Sometimes the wind carried their murmurs, songs, prayers, coughs, the shuffling rhythm of boots. It was the sound of a defeated army learning the last lesson of war, that survival itself is a kind of surrender. The camps, when they reached them, were not the relief many had imagined. Barbed wire, watchtowers, rows of barracks made from timber and frost. The air smelled of smoke and sickness. Inside, straw was spread thin on wooden bunks. The weak lay down and did not rise again. Disease spread quickly: dysentery, typhus, pneumonia. Doctors among the prisoners tried to help, but there were no supplies. Some of the guards looked away when men collapsed. Others whispered a quiet spokojno rest now before closing the door. Weeks turned into months. The survivors learned new rhythms: roll calls at dawn, work details, long silences broken only by the wind through the fences. They spoke less each day. Their language changed to words reduced to gestures, to nods, to the small, universal vocabulary of hunger. Yet somewhere among the despair, life persisted. They built stoves from scrap metal, fashioned tools from wire, carved spoons from wood. They shared memories as if trading coins. The color of the Rhine at sunset, the sound of church bells in Prague, the smell of fields after rain. Each memory was a spark of warmth against the cold. Not all would live to see release. Of the 91,000 who marched from Stalingrad, only a fraction would ever return home. The rest would remain scattered across the vastness of the Soviet Union, buried in unmarked graves beneath forests and snow. But even those who perished left traces, names scratched into wooden walls, initials carved into tin cups, whispered prayers that hung in the air long after voices were gone. Back in Germany, their absence became a silence that settled over the nation. Families waited for letters that never came. Mothers traced names on fading telegrams. Children asked questions no one could answer. The propaganda spoke of heroism, of sacrifice, of honor preserved. But behind the words was emptiness. Stalingrad had become both wound and warning, a place where ambition froze and history changed course. In Russia, the city began to breathe again. Civilians emerged from cellars, rebuilding homes from the rubble. The smell of smoke never left, but life returned. Slowly markets, laughter, the sound of hammers on metal. The river thawed in spring, carrying away ice and debris. Fishermen cast their nets where bodies had once drifted. The sun touched the ruined walls, and grass began to grow in the cracks. Yet even as life returned, a strange reverence lingered. People walked softly among the ruins, as if afraid to disturb the dead still sleeping beneath their feet. For the Soviet soldiers who had fought there, victory brought no triumph. They too carried scars, invisible and deep. Many had lost friends, brothers, parts of themselves. When they spoke of Stalingrad, it was not as a victory, but as a memory too large to hold. The city had changed them. It had shown them that even in the harshest winter, endurance could outlast strength, and silence could outlast noise. Years later, some of the German prisoners who survived the camps would finally return home. They were thin, older than their years, eyes still distant. They stepped off trains into cities rebuilt from ruins, carrying memories no one could quite understand. They spoke softly of comrades lost, of long marches and endless snow. They did not speak of hatred. War had burned that out of them. What remained was a quiet acceptance that survival, like surrender, had its own cost. And Stalingrad remained behind them not as a city on a map, but as a place in time, frozen forever in the winter of 1943. They would dream of it sometimes, the white streets, the echo of footsteps, the river whispering beneath the ice. In those dreams, the wind still blew through broken windows, carrying the same refrain it had whispered to the dying, that all empires fall silent, and that the snow remembers everything. In the end, the long road east was not a path through geography but through memory. It led beyond captivity, beyond nations, beyond victory or defeat. It was the journey of men learning step by step what it means to endure, to keep walking through cold and emptiness, guided by nothing but the faint pulse of life itself. The road did not end at the camps or the graves. It ended in the understanding that no matter how vast the empire, how mighty the army, all roads lead eventually to silence. And somewhere, beneath that silence, the river still flows quiet, patient, eternal, carrying the story of Stalingrad eastward with the melting snow, homecoming in shadows. The war had ended long ago, but for the men who had walked the long road east, time did not end when peace was signed. It had frozen somewhere along that road between the white horizon of Siberia and the memories buried in the ruins of Stalingrad. For them, the years that followed were not years at all, but a vast stretch of silence. And then, one day, after more than a decade, the silence began to move again. Trains started westward. The prisoners were going home. They did not recognize the word at first, home. It had become an echo from another life. In the camps, they had stopped using it, replacing it with smaller words: warmth, bread, sunlight. Home had become too large, too distant to believe in. But now the guards read out lists of names, and one by one, men stepped forward, uncertain whether to feel joy or fear. For years, they had dreamed of this moment. Yet when it arrived, it felt unreal, as if they were waking from a dream only to find themselves in another. The trains moved slowly across the plains, through forests, past rivers whose names they no longer knew. The carriages were crowded and cold, but the prisoners did not complain. They stared through the windows, watching the landscape change. Snow gave way to grass, grass to farmland, and then to the familiar contours of Europe. The smell of soil, of pine, of rain scents they had forgotten returned with aching clarity. For some, the tears came suddenly, without sound. Others simply closed their eyes and pressed their hands to the glass, afraid that if they blinked, it would all vanish again. When the trains finally stopped, there were no bands waiting, no banners, no speeches. The stations were quiet, the platforms half empty. A few Red Cross workers waited with bread, soup, and blankets. Some women, wives, daughters, sisters stood among them, clutching faded photographs. They watched the carriages open and the men step out, blinking in the sunlight. For a heartbeat, there was hesitation, a stillness that hung between recognition and disbelief. Then, slowly, faces met, hands reached out, and the silence broke. Some fell to their knees, others embraced without words. The years of separation were too vast for speech to bridge. The language of war had no words for reunion. Many returned to find no one waiting. Streets had changed, houses rebuilt, families gone. Cities they had once known had been bombed, burned, and reborn under different skies. Germany itself was divided, a land cut in two, like memory split between past and present. The flags had changed, the voices in power were new. To the returning soldiers, everything felt both familiar and foreign. They walked through towns that bore their childhood names, but none of their old warmth. The past had become a place they could never return to. Some were welcomed as heroes, but most were met with silence, the awkward silence of a country eager to move forward, not look back. The word Stalingrad had become a wound. It was spoken rarely, and when it was in hushed tones, as if summoning a ghost. People listened politely to the returnees' stories, then changed the subject. There were new wars now, new borders, new fears. The men from Stalingrad belonged to another time, a time many wanted to forget. They carried the memory differently. Some buried it deep, speaking little of what they had seen or suffered. Others wrote quietly, journals, letters never sent, pages filled with words that trembled between confession and remembrance. They wrote of hunger and frost, of the faces of friends who did not return, of the river that froze over them all. They wrote not to accuse, but to preserve, to keep the ghosts from fading completely, for even silence, left too long, can erase the truth. Years passed. The survivors aged. They found work, families, routines. But Stalingrad never left them. It lingered in the corners of their days, in the way they flinched at the crack of thunder, in their dislike of winter, in the long moments when they stared at nothing at all. Wives learned not to ask questions. Children grew up with fathers who woke at night, speaking names they had never heard. At gatherings, when talk turned to the war, these men would fall silent. Sometimes, after a long pause, one would say quietly, "You cannot imagine the cold." And then the room would grow still. For the younger generation, the war was already history, a story in books, a chapter in school lessons. They read about the Eastern Front, about the Battle of Stalingrad, about the surrender of the Sixth Army. They saw maps and dates and numbers, but none of it told them what their fathers had seen: the sound of snow under boots, the weight of hunger, the strange beauty of silence in a dead city. The children of Stalingrad's survivors grew up between pride and pity, never quite sure how to reconcile the two. Some survivors sought each other out. They formed associations, small circles of men who could speak freely without fear of misunderstanding. They met in cafes, in quiet halls, in the back rooms of veterans' clubs. There, they shared memories like currency fragments of a world that only they had known. They spoke of comrades lost in the steppe, of the endless marches east, of the day the sky over the Volga turned red. Their voices were calm, steady, stripped of bitterness. They spoke not to relive, but to remember. Each man carried his own version of Stalingrad. For some, it was the city itself, the smell of dust and smoke, the echo of footsteps in the ruins. For others, it was a single moment, the last look from a dying friend, the warmth of a fire in a broken barrel, the sound of a song whispered in the dark. Together, their memories formed a mosaic, imperfect, fragmented, but alive. It was a kind of quiet resurrection, not of victory, but of endurance. In the East, the story was told differently. Stalingrad became legend, the triumph that turned the tide of the war, the symbol of Soviet strength and sacrifice. Streets and squares were named for it, medals struck in its honor. Children learned its name before they learned the names of rivers or kings. Yet even there, beneath the songs and parades, the memory carried sorrow. The price of victory was too great for pride to erase. The city had been rebuilt, but the soil beneath its foundations still held the bones of thousands. Each spring, when the thaw came, the earth gave up reminders: a helmet, a spoon, a ring, the curved steel of a weapon buried beneath time. The living built over the dead, but the past was always near. As the decades passed, the world changed again. The men of Stalingrad grew old. Their hair whitened, their hands trembled, but their eyes remained steady, pale mirrors of the snow they had once crossed. Some returned to Russia in their final years, invited as guests of reconciliation. They stood once more on the banks of the Volga, gazing out at the city that had shaped them. It was no longer rubble. The skyline shimmered with new buildings, the factories alive again, the air filled with voices. Yet beneath the hum of modern life, they could still hear it, the faint hum of silence that never left. They walked through streets that had been battlefields, touching walls rebuilt over memory. Some knelt, some prayed, some simply stood with eyes closed, listening to the ghosts. A Russian veteran, standing beside one of them, once said softly, "We were enemies once, but the same snow covered us both." The German nodded. Words were unnecessary. In that shared silence lay understanding, the kind that does not come from speeches or history books, but from memory carried in the heart. When the last survivors began to fade from the world, Stalingrad became history once more. But history could never hold it fully. The numbers, the statistics, the dates they captured, the scale but not the soul. The true story of Stalingrad lived in the quiet spaces, in the eyes of the old men sitting by windows on winter evenings, in the letters tucked away in drawers, in the way the Volga gleamed beneath the snow each year. It lived in the understanding that the line between victory and loss is thin, and that sometimes the greatest courage is simply to endure. In Germany, memorials rose. Some were grand statues, plaques, inscriptions. Others were small. A photograph on a mantle, a name carved into stone. People came to honor them, not the generals or the politicians, but the soldiers who had vanished into the east and returned as shadows. Candles flickered beside their names, their flames bending in the wind. In that soft light, their silence spoke again, reminding those who came after of the cost of pride, of the fragility of power, of the humanity buried beneath uniforms and flags. In Russia, too, the memory softened with time. The city once named for Stalin was renamed Volgograd, its identity reshaped by years and politics. Yet, to many, it would always remain Stalingrad, the city where the world changed. Tourists walked its boulevards, school children visited its museums, and every February, on the anniversary of the victory, the old veterans would gather. Their numbers grew fewer each year, their medals gleaming like pieces of frozen sunlight. They would stand together in silence, facing the river, heads bowed, and for a moment, across languages, across nations, the same feeling returned, sorrow and pride intertwined, inseparable. For the survivors who still lived, home never felt the same. They had returned, yes, but part of them had remained behind, buried beneath snow and rubble. They had learned that time does not heal all wounds, it only covers them with silence. Yet within that silence, there was peace. They had seen the worst of humanity and still found fragments of kindness. They had witnessed the collapse of empires and yet survived. That, perhaps, was victory enough. Sometimes, in the quiet of night, an old man would wake to the sound of wind outside his window and for a moment think it was the steppe, the wind sweeping over snow, the murmur of voices long gone. He would lie still, eyes open, and let the sound carry him back not in fear, but in remembrance. He would see again the white horizon, the broken city, the faces of men who had walked beside him through the frozen silence. And as sleep returned, he would whisper a name not of a place or a commander, but of a friend lost long ago. In that whisper lived the entire story of Stalingrad, not glory, not defeat, but memory itself. In the end, homecoming was not a return to a place, but to a truth that every war fades, but its echoes remain in the human heart. The men of Stalingrad carried those echoes to their final days, and when they were gone, the world still heard them in the wind over the Volga. For memory does not die with those who remember. It lingers, quiet and enduring, waiting to be heard again in another time, by another soul. And so the story of Stalingrad did not end with surrender, nor with the long road east, nor even with the homecoming of its survivors. It continued in the spaces between words, in the breath between history's pages, in the soft silence that follows when the world stops fighting. It is the silence of snow falling on forgotten graves, of rivers moving beneath ice, of hearts that remember even when the rest of the world has forgotten. It is the sound of homecoming, not in celebration, but in peace. For in the end, every soldier's journey, whether across battlefields or years, leads to the same truth, that the war within us is not won by conquest, but by compassion, by memory, by the will to endure and to forgive. And when the last of the old men closed his eyes, and the wind rose once more across the steppe, it carried with it the faint, eternal murmur of Stalingrad, the sound of an empire breathing its last, and humanity learning, at last, how to be still. Ashes and echoes. The war had moved on, yet its shadow remained, long and patient. Cities rebuilt, new nations rose, and children were born who would never hear the sound of artillery across a frozen steppe. But beneath the surface of progress, beneath the hum of modern life, Stalingrad still whispered, It lived not in monuments or medals, but in the invisible places, in the quiet between heartbeats, in the sigh of wind over water, in the pause before sleep when the mind drifts toward memory. The city had become more than a place. It was a memory the world carried in its bloodstream. Time softened the sharp edges of history, but it never erased them. Decades after the surrender, the Volga still flowed past the rebuilt factories and apartment blocks of Volgograd. Children played where ruins once stood, their laughter rising into air that had once been thick with smoke. The skyline glimmered with lights at night, and the river reflected them like scattered stars. Yet when winter came, and the fog rolled in from the east, the city seemed to hold its breath. The old ghosts returned quietly, drifting between buildings, unseen but felt reminders of the night when the sky itself had burned. Those who lived through it spoke less as years passed. The survivors of both armies grew fewer, their voices softer, their memories folded neatly like letters in a drawer. When they did speak, it was not to glorify but to explain, to make sense of what sense could not be made. We were young, they would say. We thought the world was ours to shape. And then they would fall silent, for how could words describe the weight of all they had seen, the hunger that gnawed like frost, the eyes of a friend fading in snow, the feeling of walking toward the unknown because orders said to? History could record the movements of armies, but not the trembling of hands that held the rifles. The ruins were cleared long ago, yet every spring the earth gave something back, a rusted helmet, a dented flask, a silver spoon engraved with initials no one recognized. Each fragment was a message from the past, a whisper that said, "I was here." Archaeologists cataloged them carefully, but for the locals, they were not relics. They were reminders that the soil beneath their feet was still alive with memory. Farmers plowing the outskirts sometimes struck metal and stopped their tractors, standing for a long while before covering it again. The land had absorbed too much to ever be ordinary. Far away, in museums and archives, maps of Operation Blue were studied by new generations. Scholars debated strategy, logistics, the calculus of failure. They drew lines and arrows, tracing the movements of divisions, calculating how ambition had turned to ruin. Yet none of the maps showed the thing that mattered most, the weight of silence after the last shot, the hush of snow falling on the dead. That silence was the true shape of Stalingrad, the line no pen could draw. For Germany, the memory was complicated, part guilt, part mourning, part search for meaning. The children of the war grew into leaders, teachers, and artists, carrying questions their parents could never answer. They looked to Stalingrad not as legend, but as lesson. In its defeat lay a mirror, reflecting the cost of belief without mercy, of pride without restraint. The city became a symbol not of what Germany had lost, but of what humanity could learn, that power, untempered by compassion, turns to ash in its own hands. In Russia, it was different. Stalingrad remained sacred ground, the proof of endurance, the moment when the tide turned and the impossible was done. Yet even there, among parades and medals, there was sorrow woven into pride. Every family had its absence. Every street carried a name carved in stone. Victory had been necessary, but it had not been free. In the evenings, when the sun sank beyond the river and the city lights began to glow, old men sat on benches and watched the water. They said little, they did not need to. The Volga remembered for them. As decades drifted by, the two nations met not as enemies but as visitors to the same grave. Pilgrims from both sides walked through the memorial on Mamayev Kurgan, where a colossal statue now rose above the city, a mother with a sword raised to the heavens, her face carved from grief and defiance. Beneath her gaze, the names of the fallen stretched like scripture. German veterans stood quietly among Russian families, laying wreaths where language no longer mattered. Some wept, others simply closed their eyes. The wind that swept across the hill seemed to speak for all of them, a long, low murmur that carried no blame, only remembrance. The war's machinery had rusted away, but the human heart kept turning the memory over and over, as if afraid to let it go. Artists painted it, writers described it, filmmakers tried to capture its scale, but none succeeded completely. Stalingrad was too vast for art, too human for history. It was not about who won or lost, it was about what remained after both sides were gone. It was about the smallness of victory, the enormity of survival, the quiet endurance of those who kept living because they had no other choice. There were moments, years later, when winter mornings in Volgograd felt eerily like those of 1942. The same mist over the river, the same crunch of frost beneath boots. A passerby might stop and imagine hearing the distant rumble of artillery, the faint shouts carried by wind. But it was only imagination, or perhaps memory itself, replaying softly in the air. The city had healed, but healing does not erase. It only teaches the wound to breathe again. In Germany's west, a teacher once asked his students to write what the name Stalingrad meant to them. One boy wrote, "It means my grandfather came home and never smiled again." Another wrote, "It means no one wins a war, not really." The teacher read their words and understood that remembrance had passed quietly into a new generation, stripped of hatred, dressed instead in understanding. The ghosts of Stalingrad were not gone. They had simply learned to speak through gentler voices. For the soldiers who had perished, there was no judgment left, no politics, no flags. They were not symbols. They were human beings who had once laughed, loved, and feared. Their bones rested in the same earth, German and Soviet together, the lines between them long since erased by frost and time. The snow covered all impartially, as if nature itself had decided to forgive. And perhaps that was the truest end of the battle, not in surrender or victory, but in the quiet equalizing of the dead beneath one sky. The 20th century gave way to the 21st, and the world changed again. New wars came, new empires rose and faltered, and still the story of Stalingrad lingered like an echo that refused to fade. Military academies taught it as strategy, poets spoke of it as prophecy. It remained a compass for conscience, pointing always to the cost of forgetting what war truly is. For every generation must learn, again and again, that courage and cruelty often wear the same uniform until compassion sets them apart. Some nights in Volgograd, when fog rolls low along the river and the city lights blur into the mist, the air feels almost haunted. The fishermen say they sometimes hear distant singing, a hum, faint and melodic, like a choir beneath the water. Perhaps it is the river itself, remembering, its currents still carrying fragments of the past. Voices of men who once crossed it in darkness, who fought for its banks and vanished beneath its ice. The Volga has no need for monuments. It keeps its own. Every ripple, every reflection is a prayer. In the years that followed, historians called Stalingrad the turning point of the Second World War. And they were right, but not in the way they meant. It turned not only the course of armies but the direction of thought. It showed that endurance could outlast domination, that human will could rise from ruin, that even in the coldest winter, mercy was not entirely extinguished. It forced the world to look inward and see the fragility of its own ambitions. After Stalingrad, conquest lost its luster. The idea of invincibility cracked, and through that crack came light. For those who still visit, the city feels alive with contradiction. New buildings beside old scars, laughter above soil that once trembled with war. Children skate on winter ponds where tanks once sank, their laughter echoing across the same wind that once carried cries for help. Life goes on, and in that going on lies the quiet triumph that no army could claim. Stalingrad's greatest victory was not in defeating an enemy, but in proving that life could return at all. When the last veterans passed away, their funerals were attended by strangers who owed them everything. Flags draped their coffins, choirs sang softly, and candles flickered against the cold. The mourners bowed their heads, not in mourning for a battle, but in gratitude for peace. In those ceremonies, there was no separation of nations, only the shared silence of people who had finally learned what the old soldiers had always known, that every grave dug in war is the same depth, every tear the same salt, every life the same fragile thread. In the end, the story of Stalingrad is the story of all empires. They rise from ambition, they burn in glory, they collapse into ruin, and then they whisper lessons to those who come after. Some listen, most forget, but the earth remembers, the wind remembers, the river remembers. And somewhere, in that remembering, there is hope that humanity, for all its folly, might one day choose understanding over conquest, compassion over pride. As evening falls over the Volga, the city glows gold beneath the setting sun. The great statue on the hill casts its shadow far across the water, reaching toward the horizon, where once the enemy came. The wind stirs through the grass, carrying the faint scent of rain and distant smoke. Somewhere, a church bell rings, its tone soft and lingering. The river catches the sound and carries it downstream, out to the wider world, mingling it with the endless murmur of time. And there, in that mingling, in the soft meeting of sound and silence, of past and present, the story of Stalingrad continues, not as tragedy, not as triumph, but as truth. The truth that even in ruin there can be grace, that even in defeat there can be wisdom, that even in ashes, the echo of humanity endures. The city sleeps, the river flows, and the wind whispers through the years, that nothing built on suffering lasts forever. But what is learned from suffering just might. And so, as the night settles over Volgograd and the lights shimmer on the water, history itself seems to exhale a long, quiet breath, and the world listens once more to the Lullaby of Empires. The Lullaby of Empires night settles over the river again. The Volga moves quietly, its surface a mirror for the dimming sky. Lights shimmer along the banks of Volgograd, reflections trembling like the last embers of a long-burned fire. Somewhere, a distant train hums across the plain, its echo fading into the dark. The world has changed beyond recognition since the winter of 1943. Yet in the hush of evening, the city still seems to remember, and perhaps it always will. For memory, once born, does not die, it simply drifts, like a current beneath time. Every empire begins the same way, with belief, a dream of order, of destiny, of a greatness that will outlast mortality. Men draw borders on maps and call them eternal. They build cities, forge armies, and convince themselves that history bends to their will. But history listens to no master. It is the quiet force that waits behind ambition, patient as the sea, eroding the cliffs of certainty grain by grain. The Germans marching east in the summer of 1942 believed they carried the future with them. What they met instead was the truth. Every empire must learn that the earth is older than ideology, and the human heart is stronger than steel. When Stalingrad fell silent, it was not the silence of victory, but of revelation. The idea of invincibility shattered. The myth of endless conquest collapsed beneath snow and hunger, and from that ruin rose a lesson older than any nation, that no power endures without mercy, and no flag can outlast the lives it consumes. It is a lesson written not in books but in soil, in the frozen ground where soldiers from every land lie side by side, their differences erased by time. If you stand on Mamayev Kurgan at dusk, you can feel it a pulse beneath the wind, as though the hill itself breathes. You look out over the river, and the horizon seems infinite. It was here that thousands fell, their voices mingling into one long exhale that still drifts across the steppe. At sunset, the statue's shadow stretches across the city like a benediction, and the air hums with something you cannot name. It is not sorrow, not exactly. It is remembrance, the soundless agreement between the living and the dead that none of it was in vain if it is remembered with honesty. Beyond Russia, beyond Germany, the echoes of Stalingrad ripple outward still. They cross continents and decades, weaving through every story where power meets its mirror. They remind us that war is not an event, but a condition, one that begins quietly, in the certainty that we are right. They remind us that progress built on suffering carries its own collapse within it. And they remind us that the smallest acts, a soldier sharing bread with his enemy, a mother rebuilding a home from ashes, a teacher whispering history to her students, are what truly hold the world together when empires fall apart. It is easy, with distance, to turn war into legend, to speak of tactics, to analyze maps, to honor courage while forgetting cost. But the true story is softer and far more human. It is the story of men writing letters they would never send, of women waiting by doors that never opened, of children who learned to live with silence. It is the story of what comes after the noise, the rebuilding, the forgiving, the remembering. And it is here, in the quiet aftermath, that the meaning of Stalingrad lives. For it is not only a warning of destruction, but a hymn to endurance. Empires do not die all at once, they fade gradually, like twilight. A policy here, a boundary there, an idea outlived by its own consequence. Then, one day, they are gone, leaving behind language, architecture, ghosts. What remains are the stories told and retold until they become something more than history, something like a conscience. The Roman ruins on the Tiber, the stones of Constantinople, the silent fields of Verdun, the snow of Stalingrad, each sings the same melody in a different key. It is the lullaby of empires, a song of rise and fall, of arrogance and awakening, of beginnings that always carry their own endings. In this way, Stalingrad is not an exception, but a continuation. It belongs to a long chain of human endeavor stretching back to the first walls ever built. What makes it different is its clarity, the moment when modernity met its reflection and found itself capable of annihilation. The same technology that promised progress delivered ruin. The same discipline that built civilization built death camps and firestorms. And yet, within that darkness, the same human spirit that destroys also endured. That paradox, that fragile, impossible balance, is the essence of what it means to be human. If you listen closely, you can still hear it. Not the roar of artillery, but the sound beneath it, the heartbeat of humanity continuing despite itself. In hospitals rebuilt over bomb craters, in lovers holding hands beneath statues once meant for soldiers, in the quiet classrooms where children trace the map of Europe and learn that once, long ago, the world tore itself apart. The heartbeat is there, steady and resilient, reminding us that history is not only what we inherit, but what we choose to remember. For memory is not a burden, it is a compass. It does not exist to anchor us in sorrow, but to guide us toward mercy. Each generation inherits the silence of the last. What they do with it determines whether the silence becomes wisdom or merely forgetfulness. To remember, Stalingrad is not to live in grief, but to understand what it means to be alive at all, to know that life is precious precisely because it can be lost so easily. The world of today is built on the ashes of yesterday, though we rarely stop to notice. The steel of modern bridges may once have been forged from melted tanks. The soil that feeds new cities was once scorched by fire. Every age walks upon the ruins of another, just as every civilization carries within it the seed of its own ending. But endings are not failures. They are part of the great rhythm of existence, the same rhythm that beats through hearts, through history, through the turning of the earth itself. Perhaps that is why Stalingrad endures in memory more than any other battle. It is not merely about destruction. It is about return, the slow, patient return of life after devastation. It shows that even from the deepest winter, spring can rise. That even when the world seems broken beyond repair, something tender still grows in the cracks. It is a story of loss, yes, but also of redemption. The redemption that comes from understanding, from compassion, from the refusal to let the dead be forgotten. And so, as the river keeps flowing and the seasons keep turning, the lullaby continues. It is sung not by nations, but by time itself. It carries no anthem, no victory, only the soft refrain that all things end and begin again. The Roman soldier on the Rhine, the Byzantine guard at the walls, the pilot over London, the infantryman on the Volga, each heard it in their final moments, that same quiet melody rising through the noise. It is the sound of the world exhaling, of history reminding itself that nothing built on cruelty can endure, but everything built on kindness leaves an echo that never fades. If you close your eyes, you can hear it now, the murmur of the river, the whisper of the wind, the faint echo of distant bells. It asks for no tears, no applause. It asks only remembrance. For remembrance is love in its most enduring form. To remember is to keep alive what time would otherwise erase, to grant the past the dignity of being understood. And in that understanding, perhaps, lies the only true peace humanity will ever know. Night deepens. The stars emerge one by one above the Volga, their light reflected on the slow-moving water. Somewhere, a single light flickers in a window, a lamp left burning, as it has been every night for 80 years. For those who never came home, the city sleeps, the river moves on. And far beyond its banks, across continents and generations, the story of Stalingrad drifts quietly onward, woven now into the great tapestry of human memory. There will be new empires, new dreams, new mistakes. The cycle will begin again, as it always does. But perhaps, somewhere deep within the collective heart of humanity, the song will linger, a warning, a prayer, a promise, that the next time we stand at the edge of our own making, we will remember the snow, the silence, the surrender. We will remember how fragile we are and how beautiful that fragility can be. And when the wind rises over the steppe, carrying with it the scent of snow and distance, it will whisper once more the old refrain, the song that has no end, the song that outlives empires, the song that belongs to us all, that nothing is forever, that mercy is strength, and that the quietest voices are the ones time remembers. The river flows, the stars look on, and the world, for a moment, is still. The story is told, the empire sleeps, and history hums its eternal tune, the Lullaby of Empires.